The morning had started off like any other camping trip. My backpack was packed with the essentials: a sturdy tent, a reliable sleeping bag, a modest supply of food, and my trusty flashlight. The air was crisp, and the sun hung low in the sky as I made my way up into the dense forest that bordered the national park. It was a place I'd visited many times, familiar yet always presenting a new challenge. This time, I'd chosen a less traveled path, hoping for some peace and solitude. The trail was uneven, winding through towering pines and rocky clearings. Birds chirped sporadically, their songs echoing in the otherwise quiet woods. Occasionally, I'd stop to catch my breath, letting the sounds of nature envelop me. The isolation was exactly what I'd been looking for, a break from the constant hum of everyday life. By midday, I reached a small clearing near a shallow stream. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the ground. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of earth a little ways from the stream, making sure it was secure against the occasional gust of wind. After that, I gathered some stones to build a fire ring and set up my small camp stove to prepare a quick meal. As the afternoon stretched on, I decided to explore the area. The forest felt alive, but not in an overwhelming way. The rustle of leaves underfoot, the faint trickle of the stream, and the distant hum of insects created a serene backdrop. I came across an old, overgrown path, barely visible under the moss and fallen leaves. Intrigued, I decided to follow it for a while, marking my trail with small cairns to ensure I could find my way back. The path led me to an open meadow, surrounded by trees so tall their tops seemed to touch the sky. Wildflowers bloomed in patches, and the distant sound of a waterfall hinted at another hidden gem nearby. It was breathtaking, the kind of place that made you forget about time. I sat on a fallen log, soaking it all in. This, I thought, was why I loved camping. I lingered longer than I should have. By the time I decided to head back, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the forest in a dim, golden glow. The trail I'd followed earlier seemed less obvious now. My cairns were harder to spot in the fading light, and the dense undergrowth blurred the path's edges. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach my campsite before nightfall. As darkness settled in, the forest transformed. The warm, inviting atmosphere gave way to something colder, more imposing. The chirping of birds had ceased, replaced by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. My flashlight, though bright, seemed feeble against the vast darkness. I felt a growing unease, but I reminded myself that I'd been in situations like this before. I just needed to stay calm and focus on finding my markers. But the markers were gone. Whether they'd been knocked over or I'd simply missed them in the dark, I couldn't tell. Panic began to creep in as I realized I was lost. I tried retracing my steps, but the forest seemed to shift around me, each tree blending into the next. The comforting familiarity I'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a disorienting maze of shadows and shapes. After what felt like hours of wandering, I stumbled upon a small clearing. It wasn't my campsite, but it offered a brief respite from the oppressive trees. I decided to stop and regroup. Pulling out my map and compass, I tried to pinpoint my location. The stream I'd camped near was a good landmark, but without a clear idea of where I'd strayed, the map was only marginally helpful. Still, I picked a direction that seemed most likely to lead me back and started walking again. The hours dragged on. My legs ached from the constant movement, and my stomach growled in protest of the meager snack I'd hastily eaten earlier. The forest sounds grew louder in the stillness of the night. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I tried to rationalize it. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a fox, but the fear of the unknown kept me on edge. Then I saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. Relief washed over me. It had to be my campsite. I quickened my pace, ignoring the protest of my tired legs. But as I got closer, the light didn't look like my campfire. It was smaller, more contained, like the beam of another flashlight. I hesitated, my relief giving way to caution. Who else would be out here in this remote part of the forest at this hour? Part of me wanted to call out, but another part urged me to stay silent and observe. I crouched behind a tree, watching as the light moved erratically, as if the person holding it was searching for something or someone. After a few tense moments, the light disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. I waited, straining my ears for any sound of movement. When none came, I slowly backed away, careful not to make a sound. My priority now was to put as much distance between myself and whoever that was. The rest of the night was a blur of frantic movement and mounting dread. I thought I was prepared for anything the wilderness could throw at me, but this was different. This wasn't the forest, this was something or someone else. The realization that I wasn't alone out here, that someone was wandering the woods in the dead of night, unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake. Finally, just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I found the stream. Relief flooded through me as I recognized the familiar curve of the bank and the moss-covered rocks near my campsite. I practically ran the last stretch, collapsing onto the ground when I reached my tent. I didn't linger. After a quick, jittery breakfast, I packed up my gear and started back down the trail. Every step felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders as I left the forest behind. By the time I reached my car, the sun was high in the sky, and the tension that had gripped me all night finally began to fade. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something. I'd gone into the forest seeking solitude, but I'd found something else entirely. The wilderness, I realized, wasn't just a place of beauty and peace. It could also be a place of danger, of uncertainty, where the line between safety and peril was as thin as a shadow in the dark. It started as one of those weekends you dream about during a busy work week. A quiet, solitary escape into the woods, away from emails, phone calls, and the hum of everyday life. I packed light: a small tent, a sleeping bag, my trusted camping stove, and enough food for a couple of nights. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, far from any marked trails or campsites. Somewhere remote, untouched, where I could feel truly alone. The drive was peaceful, the road winding through small towns, dense woods, and rolling hills. By the time I reached the dirt track that led to my chosen area, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows through the trees. I parked my car at the edge of the track and hoisted my backpack. The trail I followed wasn't official, just a faint path beaten down by the occasional hiker or hunter. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. After about 2 hours of walking, I found the perfect clearing. It was a small patch of flat ground surrounded by towering pines and bordered by a babbling creek. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and fallen leaves. I set up my tent near the creek, where the sound of running water would lull me to sleep. By the time I got everything in order, the sky had turned a deep orange, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I cooked a simple dinner, just some instant noodles and a can of beans, and sat by the creek, watching the sky transition from twilight to full darkness. Out here, without city lights, the stars seemed impossibly bright, a dense blanket of light stretching across the sky. It was perfect. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up early, feeling refreshed, and spent the morning exploring the area around my campsite. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, and I even spotted a deer grazing in a nearby meadow. I spent the day hiking, following the creek upstream and taking in the beauty of the untouched wilderness. I didn't see another soul all day, which was exactly what I wanted. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. It began with a sound. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard it. A faint crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, straining my ears. It was faint, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, but it was there. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a fox. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it sounded distinctly human. I stood up and shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks and dense undergrowth, but I didn't see anything. The sound had stopped. I waited for a while, standing still, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, being alone in the woods at night can make you hyper-aware of every little sound. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle, every creak of the trees seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. I kept telling myself it was just the forest's natural sounds, but deep down, I felt uneasy. The next morning, I found something that made my heart race. About 20 yards from my campsite, near the edge of the creek, I saw footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. Bare feet. They weren't mine. I had been wearing boots the entire time. The tracks were fresh, the edges still sharp in the soft soil. They led from the creek into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at the footprints, trying to make sense of them. Had someone been watching me? Was it just a coincidence? Maybe another hiker had passed through the area. But why barefoot? And why hadn't I seen or heard anyone else? I debated packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself to stay. It was broad daylight, and the thought of cutting my trip short because of some footprints felt irrational. I spent the day trying to enjoy myself, but the unease lingered. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. That night, the sounds returned. I was in my tent, lying in my sleeping bag, when I heard them. Faint, deliberate footsteps circling my campsite. My heart pounded as I lay there, trying to stay as still and quiet as possible. The footsteps would stop for a while, then start again, always just beyond the edge of my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. Shining the beam into the darkness, I saw nothing. The forest was silent. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed in my tent, clutching my camping knife, listening for any sign of movement. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. Whatever or whoever was out there, I didn't want to find out. As I packed up my campsite, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me. The walk back to my car felt endless. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my pulse quicken. I kept my knife in my hand the entire time, ready for anything. When I finally reached the dirt track where my car was parked, I felt a wave of relief. But as I approached, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My car's tires had been slashed, all 4 of them. The rubber was shredded, rendering the car completely useless. Panic set in. I was miles from the nearest road with no cell service and no way to drive out. Whoever had been watching me must have done this. I looked around, scanning the woods, but saw no one. The forest was silent, the trees standing like sentinels, indifferent to my plight. I knew I couldn't stay by the car. If someone had sabotaged it, they might come back. My only option was to hike out to the main road and hope to flag down a passing car. I grabbed my backpack, took a deep breath, and started walking. The hike was grueling. The dirt track was uneven, winding through dense forest with no clear end in sight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, paranoid that I was being followed. As the hours passed, my legs grew tired, and my water supply dwindled. The sun was starting to set, and the thought of being stuck in the woods after dark filled me with dread. Just as the last light of day was fading, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were unmistakable, coming from behind me, getting closer. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps quickened, matching my pace. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting away, putting as much distance as possible between me and whoever was following me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. The main road, a narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the forest. I burst out of the trees, gasping for breath, and stumbled onto the road. There was no one in sight, no cars, no houses, just empty road stretching in both directions. But I didn't care. I was out of the woods. I started walking along the road, hoping to find help. Eventually, a pickup truck appeared in the distance. I waved it down, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, pulled over. I explained what had happened as best I could, though I left out the part about being followed. He gave me a ride to the nearest town, where I was able to call for help. The next day, I returned to the forest with a tow truck to retrieve my car. It was still there, untouched, but the sight of those slashed tires brought back the fear. I never found out who or what was out there that weekend. The footprints, the footsteps, the slashed tires. They're questions that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I haven't been camping since. I've always been drawn to the outdoors. It's something about the simplicity of it. Just you, nature, and the raw beauty of the wilderness. That's why I planned a solo camping trip in the foothills of the Rockies last summer. It was supposed to be a weekend of quiet reflection, a break from the grind of city life. But what I got was something I'll never forget. The trip started off well enough. I had my gear meticulously packed. A sturdy tent, a reliable sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a map, and a fully charged GPS device. I'd picked a spot near a river, about a 6-mile hike from the nearest trailhead. Remote but not dangerously so, or so I thought. The trail was peaceful that first day. The sun was warm, filtering through the trees and casting dappled shadows on the path. I passed a few hikers heading back to their cars, exchanged brief nods, and kept going. By late afternoon, I reached my campsite, a small clearing near the riverbank. The sound of rushing water was soothing, and the area seemed untouched, pristine. After setting up my tent and getting a small fire going, I sat back to enjoy the evening. The stars came out, brighter than I'd seen in years, and the forest around me settled into a rhythm of crickets and distant rustlings. Felt perfect, exactly what I'd hoped for. The first sign that something was off came the next morning. I woke early, as I always do when camping, and stepped out of the tent to stretch. That's when I noticed it. A faint trail of disturbed dirt leading from the edge of my campsite toward the woods. First, I brushed it off as nothing. Maybe an animal had wandered through during the night. I couldn't remember hearing anything unusual, but then again, I'd slept pretty deeply. I decided to follow the trail for a few yards, just to see where it led. It didn't go far, maybe 50 feet into the trees, before it disappeared entirely. The forest floor was too dense with pine needles and undergrowth to hold a clear track. Satisfied it was nothing, I headed back to camp, made breakfast, and prepared for a day hike. The hike was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It's not uncommon to feel that way in the wilderness, where your senses are heightened and the silence can play tricks on you. Still, every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder or pausing to listen. But there was nothing, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was dipping low in the sky. I cooked dinner, read for a while by the firelight, and eventually crawled into my tent. Sleep came harder that night, The forest sounds that had seemed soothing the night before now felt intrusive, too loud. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. But after a few minutes, the sound stopped, and I convinced myself it was just an animal. The next morning, things took a turn. When I stepped out of the tent, I found that my gear had been disturbed. The cooler where I'd stored my food was open, the contents scattered. At first, I assumed a bear had gotten to it, but there were no claw marks or bites on the cooler. It had been opened, not torn apart. And my backpack, which I'd left leaning against a tree, was now lying on its side several feet away. I checked my supplies and found that nothing was missing, though the disarray was unsettling. Determined not to let it ruin my trip, I reorganized everything and decided to stay one more night. After all, I'd come here for solitude and adventure, and I wasn't going to let a little weirdness drive me away. That day, I stayed close to camp. I spent the morning fishing in the river and the afternoon exploring the surrounding woods. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest felt different, heavier somehow. The silence wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that made your skin prickle and your stomach churn. As evening fell, I built up the fire higher than usual, its light and warmth a small comfort. I ate dinner, drank a beer, and tried to relax. But the unease wouldn't leave me. I kept glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight, half expecting to see what? I didn't know. Something. It was around midnight when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were closer, circling the edge of the clearing. My fire was still burning, and I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the woods. "Hello," I called out, my voice steady but my heart pounding. No answer, just the crunch of leaves, now retreating, fading into the night. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire until dawn, my flashlight and a knife within arm's reach. As soon as it was light enough to see, I broke camp. I packed quickly, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The forest was unnervingly quiet, as if it was holding its breath. By the time I started hiking back toward the trailhead, my nerves were frayed. The hike out was grueling, not because of the terrain, but because of the growing sense of dread. Every snap of a twig, every shadow in the corner of my eye set my heart racing. I kept a steady pace, determined to get back to my car as quickly as possible. About a mile from the trailhead, I saw something that stopped me cold. On the ground, partially hidden by undergrowth, was a tattered piece of fabric. It looked like part of a shirt, faded and dirty. Next to it, half buried in the dirt, was a boot. Not just any boot, a hiking boot, the kind I'd seen on countless trails. My first thought was that someone had lost them, but the way they were positioned, it didn't feel right. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to leave it, to get to my car and put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But I couldn't. If someone was out here, injured or worse, I couldn't just walk away. I marked the spot on my GPS and kept moving. When I reached the trailhead, there was no relief, only urgency. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported what I'd seen. They took it seriously, asking for every detail and sending a team out to investigate. A week later, I got a call. The rangers had found a campsite not far from where I'd found the fabric and boot. It was abandoned, overgrown, but they'd found more clothing, a rusted knife, and other personal items. They didn't tell me much, only that it looked like it had been there for years. No sign of the person who'd left it, no indication of what had happened. The rangers thanked me for reporting it and assured me they'd keep investigating. But I knew they probably wouldn't find anything. The wilderness has a way of swallowing things whole, leaving only questions. I haven't been camping since. I still love the outdoors, but something about that trip changed me. It's not the thought of bears or storms or getting lost that scares me anymore. It's the unknown, the things that move in the shadows, just out of sight. And most of all, it's the realization that sometimes the scariest thing in the wilderness isn't nature, it's people. It started as a spur-of-the-moment trip, a chance to disconnect from the grind of work and immerse myself in nature. I'd been working long hours, buried in spreadsheets and deadlines, and I craved the simplicity of the outdoors. So, I packed my gear, loaded up my car, and headed out to a remote camping site I'd read about online. The reviews promised solitude, stunning views, and a network of trails that would challenge even seasoned hikers. It was exactly what I needed. The campsite was nestled deep within the forest, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The last 30 minutes of the drive were on a dirt road that twisted and turned through dense trees. I could feel the hum of civilization fading with every mile. By the time I pulled into the clearing that served as a parking area, my phone had lost service. I wasn't bothered. I'd planned for this. I had a map, a compass, and enough supplies to last me 3 days. The air was crisp and carried the scent of pine and damp earth. I slung my backpack over my shoulders and set out on the trail. The path was narrow, flanked by towering trees whose branches intertwined overhead, forming a natural canopy. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional chirp of birds. It felt good to be away from the constant buzz of notifications and traffic. Here, it was just me and the wilderness. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing by a lake. The water was so still it mirrored the sky and the surrounding forest. This was where I decided to set up camp. I pitched my tent on a patch of level ground, gathered some wood for a fire, and unpacked my gear. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I was sitting by a crackling fire, eating a simple meal of canned beans and bread. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. The first night passed without incident. I'd expected to struggle to fall asleep. The ground was harder than my mattress at home, and the noises of the forest were unfamiliar, but exhaustion took over and I slept deeply. I woke up to the sound of birdsong and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. The map showed a network of trails radiating from the lake, some leading to higher ground with promises of panoramic views. I chose a trail that seemed manageable but still challenging. It wound its way uphill, weaving through dense clusters of trees and crossing over small streams. As I climbed, the terrain grew steeper, and the forest thinned out, giving way to rocky outcrops and patches of wildflowers. The higher I went, the more the view expanded. By midday, I reached a ridge that offered a breathtaking panorama of the valley below. I could see the lake where I'd set up camp, glinting in the sunlight like a shard of glass. It was a moment of pure contentment. The descent was trickier than the climb. The loose rocks made the path treacherous, and I had to move carefully to avoid slipping. About halfway down, I noticed something unusual. A small pile of rocks had been arranged deliberately on the side of the trail. It wasn't the kind of thing nature would create on its own. Someone had been here recently. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe another hiker had passed through. But as I continued down the trail, I noticed more of these rock piles, spaced at irregular intervals. Each one seemed to grow more elaborate, with sticks and bits of moss added to the arrangement. By the time I reached the lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the area recently, maybe even while I was out hiking. I scanned the clearing where my tent was pitched but saw no signs of disturbance. Everything was just as I'd left it. Still, the thought lingered in my mind as I went about the rest of my day. I spent the evening fishing by the lake and cooking my catch over the fire. The fresh air and exertion had worked up an appetite, and the meal tasted better than anything I'd had in weeks. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The forest, which had seemed so inviting during the day, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made me tense. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound didn't come again. Telling myself it was just an animal, I eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore a different trail. This one led to a series of small waterfalls about 3 miles from the campsite. The hike was less strenuous than the previous days, and the sound of rushing water was a welcome change from the silence of the forest. I spent a couple of hours there, taking in the scenery and snapping a few photos with the small camera I'd brought along. It was mid-afternoon by the time I started back. As I neared the campsite, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. One of the rock piles I'd seen the day before was now at the edge of the clearing where my tent stood. It hadn't been there that morning. I'd walked past the spot on my way to the waterfalls, and I was certain I would have noticed it. The arrangement was intricate, almost like a miniature sculpture. Someone had been here while I was gone. I checked my tent and my belongings. Nothing was missing or out of place, but the sense of unease was impossible to ignore. I considered packing up and leaving, but the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, and I didn't relish the idea of navigating the dirt road in the dark. I decided to stay one more night, though I resolved to keep my knife within easy reach. That evening, I kept the fire going longer than usual. The flames provided a sense of security, though I knew they would do little to deter anyone determined to approach. I sat by the fire, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises, a branch snapping, the crunch of leaves underfoot, but they were too sporadic and distant to pinpoint. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the zipper partially open so I could see the fire and the surrounding area. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. The forest was deathly quiet. It took me a moment to realize what had woken me. A sound, close by. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of fabric being brushed against or moved. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining to hear more. Then came another sound, this one unmistakable, the faint crunch of footsteps just outside the tent. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the sound began again, moving around the tent. Whoever it was, they were circling me. I didn't dare move. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? Another camper? Someone up to no good? Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening intently. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, I gathered the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty. The embers of the fire cast long shadows, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. I scanned the tree line, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Nothing moved. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in the tent, the knife clutched in my hand. Sleep was out of the question. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear and left. The hike back to the car felt like it took an eternity. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made me jump. When I finally reached the parking area, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The car was just as I'd left it. I threw my backpack into the trunk, got behind the wheel, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was back on the main road, with the forest fading into the distance, that I allowed myself to relax. I'd gone into the wilderness seeking peace and solitude, but I'd found something else entirely, a reminder that nature, while beautiful, can also be unpredictable and unsettling. I don't know who or what was out there with me, and maybe it's better that way. All I know is that I'll think twice before venturing into the woods alone again. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape, just a weekend away from the grind, with nothing but the woods, the fresh air, and my own thoughts to keep me company. I'd been feeling burned out lately, so I figured some solo camping would help me reset. I picked a remote spot in the forest, well off the beaten path. No campgrounds, no picnic tables, just wilderness. Exactly what I needed. The drive out there was uneventful. I'd packed everything carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, my GPS, and a fully charged power bank. I double-checked my gear at home and felt prepared. The dirt road leading to the trailhead was rough, but my old SUV handled it without a problem. I parked at the edge of a small clearing and set off on foot, my backpack snug against my shoulders. The hike in was beautiful. The air was crisp and cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I followed a faint trail that seemed rarely used, my boots crunching softly against the dirt. I'd researched this area thoroughly. It was remote enough that I probably wouldn't see another soul, but not so isolated that I couldn't find my way back if something went wrong. The trail wound through towering pines and dense underbrush, eventually leading to a small, secluded meadow near a creek. It was perfect. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent on a flat patch of ground and laying out my gear. The creek was close enough to provide fresh water, but far enough that the sound wouldn't keep me awake. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I started a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to enjoy the solitude. The stars came out one by one, brilliant against the inky blackness of the sky. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. The first night passed without incident. I woke early, the morning light filtering through the thin fabric of my tent. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek upstream, clambering over rocks and fallen logs. The forest felt alive around me, but in a comforting way. Every so often, I stopped to take in my surroundings. The way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, the distant sound of birdsong. Felt good to be out here, away from everything. By late afternoon, I'd covered a fair bit of ground and was starting to feel tired. I headed back to camp, taking a slightly different route to see more of the area. That's when I found it. A strange pile of rocks, arranged in a rough circle. It wasn't natural, that much was clear. Someone had stacked the stones deliberately, though it didn't look like any kind of fire pit or marker I'd seen before. The arrangement was odd, almost ritualistic. I stood there for a while trying to make sense of it, but in the end I shrugged it off. People leave weird things in the woods sometimes. Back at camp, I tried to push the strange discovery out of my mind. I made dinner, watched the sunset, and settled in for another quiet evening. But as darkness fell, I started to feel off. The forest seemed different somehow. The usual sounds of nocturnal life, crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, were absent. It was eerily quiet. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just spooking myself over the pile of rocks. But the uneasy feeling lingered. I kept glancing toward the edge of the firelight, half expecting to see something lurking just beyond the glow. Of course, there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and lay down in my sleeping bag. The silence outside was oppressive, and every little noise, the creak of a tree, the rustle of fabric as I shifted, seemed magnified. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I felt groggy and irritable. I decided to stay close to camp that day, partly because I was tired and partly because I didn't want to risk getting lost in my current state. I spent the morning gathering firewood and tidying up my campsite. By afternoon, I was feeling a bit more like myself. The uneasy feeling from the night before had faded, and the forest seemed normal again. But then, as I was stacking wood near the fire pit, I noticed something strange. One of my water bottles was missing. I distinctly remembered placing it near my pack, but it wasn't there. I searched the area thoroughly, even checking inside the tent, but it was nowhere to be found. It didn't make sense. I'd been careful to keep my things organized. I told myself I must have misplaced it, though that explanation didn't sit right with me. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the uneasy feeling returned as night fell. I double-checked everything before going to bed, making sure my gear was where it should be. I even tied the zipper of my tent shut with a bit of cord, just in case. That night, I woke suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. I lay still, listening. The forest was silent again, but there was something else. A faint, rhythmic sound, almost like footsteps. It was distant at first, but it grew steadily louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The seconds stretched into eternity. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I lay there, paralyzed, until the first light of dawn crept through the fabric of my tent. When I finally emerged, the campsite looked undisturbed. But something was wrong. Another item was missing, this time one of my cooking utensils. It didn't make sense. No animal would take something like that, and I hadn't seen another person for miles. I packed up quickly, deciding to cut the trip short. Whatever was going on, I didn't want to stick around to find out. The hike back to the trailhead was nerve-wracking. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set my heart racing. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though unseen eyes were watching my every move. When I finally reached my car, relief washed over me. I threw my pack into the back and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something terrible. To this day, I don't know what happened out there. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the isolation of the woods. Or maybe someone or something really was out there watching me. All I know is that I've never been so glad to leave a place behind. It was the first weekend of October when I decided to escape the city. The weeks had been dragging. My job felt like it was swallowing me whole, and I needed a break from screens, noise, and the endless gray of the city streets. I packed light: a tent, a sleeping bag, some dehydrated meals, and my trusty old hiking boots. I chose a remote spot, a place I'd heard about from a coworker who swore by its solitude. Deep in the woods, far from cell service, it sounded perfect. The drive out was uneventful, though the last hour was on a dirt road that twisted through dense forest. By the time I reached the trailhead, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the trees. I parked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and set off. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding through groves of towering pines and occasional clearings where the sunlight spilled in golden patches. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It took me about 2 hours to reach my chosen campsite. It was a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to form a protective wall around the area. The stream's gentle babble was the only sound, and I relished the quiet. I pitched my tent quickly, gathering some stones to form a small fire ring and setting up a spot to cook. By the time I had everything in place, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was bathed in a dim blue-gray twilight. I ate a quick dinner of instant noodles and sipped on hot tea, letting the warmth seep into my hands as the temperature dropped. The stars began to emerge, one by one, until the sky was a sprawling canvas of light. I lay back on a flat rock, staring up, marveling at how small I felt beneath it all. It was the kind of moment I'd been craving, still, quiet, and untouched by the chaos of my daily life. The first night passed without incident. I woke up to the sound of birds and the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. After a simple breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the stream for a while, climbing over rocks and weaving through the trees. The further I went, the less distinct the trail became. Eventually, I found myself in a part of the forest that felt untouched, as if no one had walked there in years. The air was heavier here, the trees taller and closer together. It felt like the kind of place nature had reclaimed entirely. I spent the day wandering, taking photos, and soaking in the quiet. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already dipping low. I built a fire and cooked another simple meal, feeling the ache in my legs from the day's hike. The night crept in quickly, and with it came a chill that made me pull my jacket tighter around me. As I sat by the fire, I noticed something odd. The forest seemed quieter than the night before. The usual rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, even the distant hoot of an owl, all absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as the hours stretched on, I couldn't ignore the tension in the air. I decided to call it a night and retreated to my tent. Inside, wrapped in my sleeping bag, I listened intently to the silence. It was unnerving, but exhaustion eventually pulled me into sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know what had stirred me. The fire outside had died down to embers, and the tent was pitch black. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it, a faint rustling coming from the direction of the stream. It wasn't the sound of water or wind. It was deliberate, like something moving through the underbrush. My heart began to pound as I strained to hear more. The sound grew closer, though still faint. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But then came a sound that froze me, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. Someone was walking through the woods. I lay completely still, my mind racing. I had seen no one else on the trail, and this spot was miles from the nearest road. Who could it be? And why would they be out here in the dead of night? The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I wanted to peek out of the tent, but fear rooted me in place. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time felt stretched and warped. Then, just as I began to think whoever it was had moved on, I heard another sound. This time it was closer, just outside the tent. A low, metallic clink, like something brushing against my tent poles. Couldn't breathe. My mind raced through all the possibilities. A lost hiker, a harmless camper, or something far worse. I reached for the small camping knife I kept by my side, gripping it tightly in my trembling hand. I stayed like that, every muscle tensed, until the first light of dawn began to creep through the fabric of the tent. Only then did I muster the courage to unzip it and peer outside. The clearing was empty, no sign of anyone. But as I stepped out, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Faint footprints in the dirt, leading away from my tent toward the stream. They weren't mine. I spent the morning packing up, my nerves frayed. I debated whether to stay another night or cut my trip short. Part of me wanted to believe it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the footprints were real, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In the end, I decided to move to a new campsite further up the trail. The hike was exhausting, partly because of the weight of my pack and partly because of the constant glances I threw over my shoulder. By midday, I found another clearing, this one higher up on a ridge. It felt safer, more open, with a good view of the surrounding forest. I set up camp quickly, trying to shake off the lingering unease. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I forced myself to relax. I built a fire, ate, and even managed to enjoy the stars again. The sounds of the forest had returned, and the normalcy was comforting. I told myself that whatever had happened the night before was behind me. But when I woke in the middle of the night again, the unease came rushing back. This time, the sound wasn't footsteps. It was something far worse. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere outside the tent. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like a signal or a code. I sat up, gripping the knife again, my breathing shallow. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, though I'm sure it was only minutes. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, oppressive. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the knife, my ears straining for any sound. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out of the tent, my body stiff from fear and lack of sleep. The first thing I noticed was the tapping sound, or rather, its source. On the ground, near the edge of the clearing, lay a stick. It had been propped up against a tree, positioned in such a way that it could fall and tap against the bark when disturbed. It was a crude setup, but it was enough to send a clear message. Someone had been here, and they wanted me to know. That was it for me. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't stop to eat or rest. I just started hiking, retracing my steps back to the car. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart leap. The hike back felt endless, the forest pressing in on me from all sides. When I finally reached the car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors the moment I got inside. My hands were trembling so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, surrounded by the comforting chaos of people and noise. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. I've replayed those nights in my head over and over, trying to make sense of it, but I can't. All I know is that I won't be going back to those woods again. The plan was simple: a 3-day camping trip to unplug from the grind and reconnect with nature. I'd been looking forward to it all week, and the idea of solitude sounded perfect. The campground I picked was remote, but not completely isolated, tucked into a dense forest with only a few scattered sites. It had a reputation for being quiet, just the kind of place I needed to reset. The drive took me 3 hours, winding through roads that seemed to narrow with every mile. By the time I reached the dirt path leading to the site, my phone signal had vanished entirely. That was fine by me. I parked the car at a designated lot, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and set off down the trail toward my spot. It was about a mile in, far enough to feel secluded, but not so far that I couldn't retreat to the car if needed. The forest was beautiful. Towering pines filtered the sunlight into golden beams that danced on the forest floor, and the air smelled clean and sharp with the scent of pine needles. I felt the stress begin to melt away as I walked. Birds chirped, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at small animals going about their day. It felt good to be out here, away from the hum of the city. When I reached my campsite, it was exactly as described on the map. A clearing with a fire pit surrounded by a few large rocks and enough space to pitch a tent. I dropped my bag and got to work setting up. The tent went up easily, a small 2-person shelter that was just big enough for me and my gear. I rolled out my sleeping bag inside and arranged my supplies: food, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, in an organized pile. The firewood I'd brought along was neatly stacked by the pit, ready for later. The first day passed uneventfully. I explored a bit, following a narrow trail that led to a small creek about half a mile from my site. The water was cold and clear, and I spent some time skipping stones and letting the sound of the rushing water fill my ears. By the time I got back, the sun was starting to set. I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal of canned soup and crackers. The stars came out one by one, and I sat there for hours, staring up at the night sky. It was a kind of quiet I hadn't experienced in years, and it felt good. The first night, I slept deeply. The sounds of the forest were a comforting backdrop. Crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. When I woke the next morning, the sun was already filtering through the trees, and the air had a crisp chill to it. I made coffee on my portable stove, the warmth of the mug a welcome comfort as I planned out my day. I spent most of the second day hiking. There were trails crisscrossing the area, and I followed one that seemed less traveled. It led me to a ridge with a stunning view of the surrounding forest, a sea of green stretching out to the horizon. I sat there for a while, eating a granola bar and taking it all in. Time seemed to slow down out here, each moment stretching out in a way that felt rare and precious. It was on the way back to my campsite that I noticed something odd. As I neared the clearing, I saw that the rocks around the fire pit had been disturbed. They were scattered, as if someone had kicked them. My gear was untouched, though, and nothing seemed to be missing. I brushed it off as an animal. Maybe a raccoon had gotten curious. Still, it left me feeling uneasy. That night, the forest felt different. The noises were there, but they seemed sharper, more deliberate. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness, and I found myself clutching the flashlight tighter. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. The fire burned low as I sat there, listening. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I retreated to the tent, zipping it up tightly behind me. I woke up to the sound of movement outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, but it was close. My heart thumped as I reached for the flashlight. Shining it through the fabric of the tent didn't reveal much, just vague shadows. I held my breath, listening. The rustling stopped, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. It wasn't an animal. I was sure of that. For a long time, I stayed frozen, clutching the flashlight like it was some kind of weapon. Eventually, the sounds faded, and the forest went quiet again. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent to find more signs that someone, or something, had been there. The firewood I'd stacked was scattered across the clearing, and my water bottle, which I'd left on the picnic table, was on the ground a few feet away. There were no clear footprints, just the vague impression of something having moved through the dirt. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but something stubborn in me resisted. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. I convinced myself to stay, but the unease lingered. I spent the day close to camp, gathering more firewood and keeping myself busy. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, my ears straining for any sound out of the ordinary. That night, I built the fire higher than usual, the flames casting long shadows across the trees. I sat close to it, the warmth and light a small comfort against the growing sense of dread. The sounds in the forest seemed louder, more distinct. Twice, I thought I heard footsteps, but each time, they stopped as soon as I shone the flashlight in their direction. When I finally crawled into the tent, I left the flashlight within arm's reach. Sleep came in fits, each rustle of leaves jolting me awake. At some point in the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the tent. My pulse raced as I gripped the flashlight, ready to burst out if needed. But the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. This time, I didn't relax. I stayed awake, listening until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. As soon as it was light enough to see, I packed up. My hands shook as I stuffed the sleeping bag into its sack and disassembled the tent. I'd had enough. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to stick around to find out. The hike back to the car felt longer than it should have, every sound in the forest putting me on edge. When I finally reached the lot and saw my car, Relief washed over me like a wave. As I loaded my gear into the trunk, I glanced back at the trailhead. The forest stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something had been out there, watching, waiting. As I drove away, the tension in my chest began to ease, but the memory of those nights lingered. Even now, back in the safety of my apartment, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. The experience left a mark, a reminder that the wilderness, for all its beauty, is not a place to be taken lightly. I don't know who or what was out there, but one thing is certain. I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. Camping is something I've always loved. Just me, the trees, the stars, and the endless stillness of nature. But this time it was different. I'd gone out to a remote area in northern Maine, far from any towns or cell service. I'd planned to stay 3 nights, enough to enjoy the solitude and reset my mind from the noise of daily life. The first day was uneventful, exactly as I'd hoped. I parked my truck at the trailhead around noon, strapped on my pack, and hiked about 6 miles to a small clearing near a stream. It was a perfect spot to set up camp. Flat ground, plenty of trees for shelter, and easy access to water. By evening, my tent was pitched, my little fire was crackling, and I was settled into the rhythm of the wilderness. The first night was calm. The soft hum of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves lulled me to sleep. On the second day, I decided to explore the area. I followed the stream upstream for a while, hopping over rocks and ducking under branches. The forest seemed untouched, almost ancient. I didn't see a single footprint or sign of other hikers. That's why I'd come here, to be completely alone. Around midday, I found a small waterfall. The water spilled over smooth rocks into a clear pool below. It looked like something out of a postcard. I sat there for a long time, eating my lunch and letting the sound of the water wash over me. It felt like the kind of peace you can't find anywhere else. But as I started heading back to camp, I noticed something strange. The forest felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It wasn't the kind of eerie silence you hear about in horror stories. The birds were still chirping, and the wind still whispered through the trees. But something was off. The air felt heavier, and I started to feel like I was being watched. I shook it off, blaming it on my imagination. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't anyone around to watch me. Still, the feeling didn't go away. It clung to me like a shadow as I made my way back to camp. When I reached the clearing, everything seemed normal. My tent was still there, my food bag was hanging untouched from a tree, and nothing looked out of place. But the unease lingered. I decided to distract myself by gathering more firewood and preparing dinner. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was feeling more at ease. The fire crackled warmly, and the familiar sounds of the forest surrounded me. That night, I woke up suddenly. My heart was pounding, though I didn't know why. The forest was dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. I lay there, straining to hear anything. An animal, the wind, anything. But there was nothing. And then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I heard it. A faint sound, like a twig snapping. It was close, too close. My pulse quickened as I sat up and fumbled for my flashlight. When I turned it on, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees outside my tent. Nothing moved. I swept the light around, my breath fogging in the cool night air. Still nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Maybe a branch had fallen. But deep down, I knew it didn't sound like that. It sounded deliberate, like someone stepping carefully through the woods. I lay back down, clutching the flashlight and my pocket knife, and eventually drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself it was just nerves. Being alone in the wilderness can mess with your mind. I spent the day fishing in the stream and exploring more of the forest. But the feeling of being watched never completely went away. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. That evening, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, I decided to make an early dinner and call it a night. As I was cooking, I noticed something odd. There were faint scuff marks in the dirt near my campfire. They weren't from me, I was sure of that. They looked like someone had been standing there, turning slightly, shifting their weight. My stomach tightened. Maybe it had been an animal, but the marks looked too deliberate, too human. I decided to stay up late, keeping the fire going and listening carefully. Hours passed, and the forest seemed normal. The usual sounds of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves filled the air. But just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and measured, coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. I froze, gripping the handle of my knife. The footsteps stopped, and for what felt like an eternity, there was silence. My eyes strained to see beyond the flickering glow of the fire, but the darkness was impenetrable. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but my throat felt like it was filled with sand. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the forest. It sounded like a branch snapping underfoot, but this time it was further away. Whoever or whatever had been there was moving off. I sat by the fire until dawn, too afraid to sleep. When morning came, I decided to pack up and leave. I'd had enough of this place. As I was packing, I found something that made my blood run cold. Near the edge of the clearing, I saw fresh footprints in the mud. They were unmistakably human, and they hadn't been there the day before. They led from the forest edge to the area near my campfire and then back into the woods. I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear together and started hiking back to the trailhead. The entire hike, I felt like I was being followed. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. When I finally reached my truck, I felt a wave of relief. But as I unlocked the door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a single muddy handprint smeared across the driver's side window. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I didn't stick around to think about it. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove as fast as I could down the dirt road. Even as the forest thinned and the small towns of Maine came into view, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I never went back to that spot. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. But one thing's for sure, I'll never camp alone in the wilderness again. I didn't think much of it when I decided to go camping alone that weekend. It was something I'd done many times before. Being out in nature, away from the hum of city life, was my way of resetting. Just me, the trees, the stars, and the endless quiet. That was the plan, at least. I picked a spot I'd been to once before, years ago. A place deep in the national forest, far enough off the beaten path that you'd be hard-pressed to find another soul. It wasn't an official campsite, no picnic tables or fire pits, but that was part of the appeal. I packed light: a tent, a sleeping bag, a small propane stove, some dehydrated meals, a water filter, and the usual essentials. My phone came along too, though service out there was non-existent. It was just a glorified flashlight and camera at that point. The drive took me 2 hours, and the hike to the spot another 3. By the time I arrived, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest was dense, the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. I found a clearing just large enough for my tent, with a small stream nearby for water. It was perfect. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent on a patch of soft ground and arranging my gear inside. As the last light faded, I lit a small camping lantern and cooked dinner, A simple meal of instant noodles and jerky. The quiet was overwhelming, but in a comforting way. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional call of a distant bird. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the forest was pitch black. I lay there for a while, staring up at the mesh of my tent and the faint glimmer of stars above. Sleep came easily. The first night passed without incident. I woke with the sun, feeling refreshed and ready to explore. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my day pack and headed out. The forest was beautiful, with towering trees and patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy. I followed the stream for a while, then veered off to climb a rocky outcrop I'd spotted in the distance. The view from the top was breathtaking, miles of unbroken forest stretching to the horizon. I spent the day wandering, losing track of time as I soaked in the solitude. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already dipping low. I made another simple meal and settled in for the evening. That night, though, I found it harder to sleep. The silence that had been so comforting now felt oppressive. Every little noise, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest, nothing to worry about. The second day followed much the same pattern. Hiking, exploring, enjoying the wilderness. But by the time I returned to camp that evening, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the clearing didn't seem quite the same. My gear was untouched, and nothing appeared out of place, but the air felt heavier, the quiet deeper. I shrugged it off, blaming my imagination. That night, the unease grew. I woke up several times, certain I'd heard something outside the tent. Each time, I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. But there was nothing, just the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. On the third day, I decided to cut my trip short. The unease had settled into a constant weight in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I packed up my gear, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. The forest, once so inviting, now felt claustrophobic. The hike back to my car was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd hear a faint rustle or crack behind me, but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the usual forest noises, but my nerves were on edge. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, a wave of relief washed over me. I loaded my gear into the trunk as quickly as I could, eager to leave the forest behind. But as I slid into the driver's seat, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the dusty rear window of my car, were smudges. Not handprints exactly, but marks that looked like someone had brushed their fingers across the glass. I stared at them for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. Had they been there when I arrived? Couldn't remember. Maybe I'd brushed against the window myself without realizing it. Or maybe I didn't stick around to figure it out. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The drive home felt endless, every shadow on the road making my heart race. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring at my darkened house. Home had never felt so safe. I never did figure out what happened on that trip. Maybe it was all in my head, a product of too much time alone in the wilderness. Or maybe, well, I don't know. All I know is that I haven't been camping alone since. The first sign that something was wrong came on the second night. I was alone in a remote part of the forest, far from the usual campsites where people gather in groups, laughing and drinking around shared fires. This trip was supposed to be different. I wanted solitude. I wanted the silence of nature to wrap around me, giving me the clarity I hadn't felt in months. My job, my relationships, Everything felt like it was closing in. So, I packed my gear, drove 6 hours out to the national forest, and hiked deep into the wilderness until I couldn't hear anything but the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The first night was uneventful. I pitched my small tent by a stream, cooked a simple meal over my portable stove, and sat by a fire I'd built from collected wood. The sky was a canvas of stars, unpolluted by city lights, and I felt a rare sense of peace. The air was cool, crisp, and filled with the scent of pine. As the fire crackled, I thought about how much I needed this, the quiet, the disconnection. I fell asleep easily that night, lulled by the sounds of the forest. The second day, I explored further into the woods. I'd marked my campsite on a map and carried a GPS just in case. The forest was dense but beautiful, with towering trees that seemed ancient, their bark rough and scarred. I came across a few deer, who froze at the sight of me before darting off into the undergrowth. A hawk circled high above, its sharp cries echoing in the stillness. I felt small but in a good way, as if the world was reminding me of its vastness. By late afternoon, I returned to my campsite, tired but satisfied. I collected more firewood, boiled water from the stream, and prepared another simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped, and the forest grew darker, the shadows stretching and merging into an inky blackness. The fire was my only source of light, casting flickering patterns on the surrounding trees. That's when I first felt it, a faint unease. At first, I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone, and solitude can make the imagination run wild. But the feeling persisted. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the sensation of being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural sounds of the forest. The crack of a branch could be a deer or a raccoon. The rustle of leaves could be the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. When I went to bed that night, the unease followed me. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to the sounds outside. The stream gurgled softly, and occasionally, I heard the faint hoot of an owl. But there was something else, too. A faint rustling, irregular and deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It was too controlled, too purposeful. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a fox or a coyote, nothing to worry about, but I kept my knife within reach just in case. The third day started as usual. The unease of the night before seemed silly in the daylight. I chalked it up to my imagination and focused on enjoying the day. I hiked further into the forest, discovering a small waterfall that spilled into a clear pool. The sight was breathtaking, and I spent hours there, sketching the scene in a notebook I'd brought along. When I returned to my campsite that evening, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. My gear was all where I'd left it. The fire pit was undisturbed, but there was a subtle difference, like the energy of the place had shifted. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. I brushed it off and went about my routine, building a fire and preparing my meal. As the night wore on, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the dark trees for movement. The firelight didn't reach far, leaving most of the forest in shadow. I told myself I was being paranoid, but when I crawled into my tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the edge of the light. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me. I lay still, listening. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No wind, no insects, no distant hoots or calls. Just silence. Then I heard it. A faint crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. It was close, too close. My heart pounded as I reached for my knife. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out, but the darkness was impenetrable. The fire had burned down to embers, offering little light. The sound stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, the sound came again, this time on the other side of the tent. Whatever it was circling me. I gripped the knife tighter, my palms slick with sweat. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there, knife in hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. When it finally came, the forest seemed to come alive again. Birds chirped, and the breeze rustled the leaves. But I couldn't shake the sense that something had been out there, watching me. I decided to cut my trip short. As much as I loved the solitude, this was too much. I packed up my gear quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it felt stronger. The hike back to my car was uneventful at first. The forest was peaceful, and I started to feel silly for letting my imagination get the best of me. But as I got closer to the trailhead, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the trail, in the soft dirt, were footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were too large, and they weren't from a hiking boot. They looked like they belonged to someone wearing worn, flat-soled shoes. The prints followed the trail, sometimes veering off into the underbrush before returning. I realized with a sinking feeling that they matched my path. Whoever had made them had been following me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got to the trailhead, the fresher the prints seemed. It was as if whoever it was had been following me all morning. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back and locked the doors. As I started the engine and drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, watching me until the forest disappeared in my rearview mirror. I reported the incident to the rangers when I reached the nearest town. They took my statement seriously but said there wasn't much they could do without more information. I left my contact details and drove home, the events of the trip replaying in my mind. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. Maybe it was just another camper, curious about the stranger in their woods. Or maybe it was someone with darker intentions. I'll never know. What I do know is that I've never felt the same about being alone in the wilderness. The solitude I once craved now feels like a vulnerability, an open invitation to things unknown. And every time I step into the woods, I can't help but wonder if something is watching, just out of sight. I've always loved the outdoors, but it's a kind of love that comes with equal parts respect and caution. So, when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the dense forest of Blackwater Ridge, I made sure to prepare meticulously. The area was remote, miles away from the nearest road, but I wanted the isolation, a chance to disconnect and reset. I packed everything I thought I'd need. A sturdy tent, plenty of food, a first aid kit, maps, a compass, and a satellite phone in case of emergencies. My gear was tried and tested, and I knew how to use it. I was confident but not careless. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, just hours of winding roads through thickening forest. I parked my car in a small gravel lot, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The trail was narrow and steep in places, but it was well marked. The deeper I went, the more the modern world seemed to fade away. The air smelled rich with pine and earth, and the only sounds were my boots crunching on the trail and the occasional call of a bird. Felt like freedom. By the time I reached my planned campsite, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I found a flat, clear spot near a small creek and set up my tent. The water's gentle burbling was soothing, and I made a mental note of its location in case I needed to refill my bottles. After gathering some firewood, I built a small fire and cooked a simple dinner of dehydrated stew. It tasted better than it had any right to out there in the woods. The warmth of the fire and the fullness in my belly made me feel safe, even as the dark pressed in around me. The first night was uneventful. I woke up early, feeling refreshed, and decided to explore the area. I'd chosen this location because it was far off the beaten path. The map showed a series of old logging roads and game trails that crisscrossed the area, and I was eager to see where they led. I spent most of the day hiking, taking care to mark my route on the map and leaving small cairns to guide me back. The forest was beautiful but dense, and it would be easy to get lost without those precautions. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed the weather starting to change. The sky grew overcast, and a chill crept into the air. I decided to head back to camp earlier than planned, not wanting to get caught in a storm. By the time I returned, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees and scattering leaves across the forest floor. I secured my tent and made another fire, but the wind made it tricky to keep the flames steady. I ate quickly and crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the wind howl outside. Sleep came fitfully that night, as the sounds of the forest seemed amplified by the storm. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world damp and quiet. The air smelled clean, and the ground was littered with branches and debris. I spent the morning tidying up the campsite and drying out my gear. It wasn't until midday that I noticed something odd. A trail of deep, fresh footprints cut through the muddy ground near my camp. They weren't mine. The prints were larger than my boots and spaced far apart, as if whoever made them had been running. They led from the direction of the creek, past my tent, and disappeared into the woods. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else since I'd arrived, and this was supposed to be a remote area. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the footprints and trying to make sense of them. Maybe it was a hunter, I thought, though I hadn't seen any sign of hunting activity. Maybe someone had gotten lost. That idea made me uneasy. If they were lost, why hadn't they called out or left a note? And why were they running? I decided to follow the prints, at least for a little while, to see if I could figure out what had happened. I grabbed my compass, map, and a knife just in case. The trail was easy to follow at first, but as I went deeper into the woods, the ground became drier and the footprints faded. I found myself standing in a small clearing, unsure of which direction to go next. The silence was oppressive, the kind that makes your ears strain for any sound. I turned back, retracing my steps to camp. The unease lingered. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. I kept the fire going until late, even though I knew it would burn through my firewood supply. I'd brought a book to read, but I couldn't focus on the words. Instead, I kept scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, my mind racing with possibilities. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a restless sleep. The third day brought more unsettling discoveries. While hiking a short distance from camp, I stumbled upon a shredded backpack hanging from a tree branch. It was faded and weathered, but the tears in the fabric looked fresh. Inside, I found a few scattered items: a water bottle, a broken flashlight, and a wallet. The ID inside belonged to a man named Eric Shaw. The photo showed a smiling face, but it was hard to imagine anything cheerful about this situation. I'd read enough stories to know what this might mean. My first instinct was to get out of there and report it to the authorities, but part of me wanted to search for more clues. What if Eric was still out there, hurt or worse? I spent the rest of the day cautiously exploring the area around the backpack, marking my route meticulously. I found no more signs of Eric, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside the tent set my nerves on edge. The wind brushing against the fabric felt like fingers. My hand never strayed far from the knife I kept by my side. By the fourth day, I was ready to leave. The trip had taken a dark turn, and I no longer felt safe. As I packed up camp, I noticed something that stopped me cold. A new trail of footprints, smaller this time, led straight to my tent and back into the woods. Someone had been here while I slept. My hands trembled as I stuffed my gear into my pack. I no longer cared about leaving the area neat or following my planned route. I just wanted to get out. The hike back to the car was a blur. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. Relief washed over me as I climbed inside and locked the doors. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on the main road. When I got home, I reported what I'd found to the local authorities. They listened politely and took down my information, but I could tell they weren't convinced. Maybe they thought I'd imagined things, or maybe they just didn't care. Weeks passed, and I never heard anything more about Eric Shaw or the footprints near my camp. The experience stayed with me, though. I still love the outdoors, but I'm more cautious now. I double-check my gear, choose campsites closer to known trails, and always let someone know exactly where I'll be. Blackwater Ridge taught me that the wilderness is beautiful, but it's not empty. There's always something out there, whether it's nature, another person, or just the shadows in your own mind. I've always loved the outdoors. There's something about being in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but trees and stars for company, that feels like a reset button for life. That's why, every couple of months, I pack my gear, lace up my boots, and head out into the wilderness. It's a chance to leave behind the noise and grind of the city, to clear my head. This trip wasn't supposed to be any different, but it was. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, miles from the nearest trailhead. I'd been there once before, years ago, and remembered it being quiet and beautiful. It's not one of those places that gets a lot of foot traffic. Perfect for some solitude. I loaded my pack with everything I'd need for a few days. Tent, sleeping bag, food, a little camp stove, and of course my trusty knife. I always carry a first aid kit and a GPS device too, just in case. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. I parked my car at the small dirt lot, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown in places, a clear sign it didn't see much use. I liked that. The further I got from the car, the more the world seemed to fall away. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds called to each other from the canopy above, and the sound of a nearby stream filled the gaps. After about 4 hours of hiking, I reached the spot I'd remembered. A clearing bordered by tall pines on 3 sides, with the stream cutting along the edge. The ground was flat and covered in soft moss. It was perfect. I set down my pack, took a long drink from my water bottle, and got to work setting up camp. The tent went up easily, and I stacked some rocks for a fire pit. By the time I was done, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting everything in golden light. I cooked a simple dinner, just a freeze-dried meal and some tea, then sat by the fire watching the flames dance. The world felt calm, like I was the only person alive. When the stars came out, I lay back on my sleeping pad and stared up at them. It's amazing how many you can see when you're far from city lights. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the sound of the stream. The first night was uneventful. I woke early, made coffee, and spent the day exploring the area. I followed the stream for a while, finding little pools where the water gathered before rushing off again. I saw deer tracks and even caught a glimpse of a fox darting through the underbrush. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was starting to set again. I made another fire, cooked another meal, and settled in for the night. It was shaping up to be exactly the kind of peaceful trip I'd been hoping for. But things started to feel off the second night. It wasn't anything dramatic, just little things that I couldn't quite explain. For one, the forest seemed quieter. During the day, it had been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, but now it felt muted. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and frogs was absent. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a natural lull in activity. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I've always been a cautious camper, so I double-checked everything before turning in. My food was hung up high in a tree, well away from camp. My fire was out, and my knife was within easy reach. Still, I lay awake for a long time listening. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed amplified in the silence. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. I woke up to the sound of movement, not the light scurrying of a squirrel or the rustle of wind through the trees. This was heavier, deliberate. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, human footsteps. I reached for my knife, my fingers closing around the handle. My tent was zipped up, and I couldn't see anything outside. The footsteps stopped just beyond my camp, and for a moment, everything was still. Then I heard it, the sound of something being dragged. It was faint but unmistakable. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, maybe? But no, it sounded too deliberate. I'd never been so acutely aware of my own breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the sound moved off, fading into the distance. I lay there, knife in hand, until the first light of dawn. When I finally emerged from my tent, the camp looked undisturbed, but the sense of unease lingered. I checked the area and found tracks in the dirt. Bootprints. Someone had been there. They weren't mine. They were larger and had a different tread pattern. My mind went to the sound I'd heard, something being dragged. I searched the area but found nothing. No sign of what it could have been. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to overreact. I'd come out here for peace, and I wasn't ready to let my imagination ruin that. I decided to stay one more night but made a plan to leave early the next morning. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That evening, I didn't make a fire. I wanted to keep a low profile. Instead, I ate a cold meal and kept my flashlight handy. The forest was dark and quiet, the silence pressing in around me. I sat with my back to a tree, my knife in my lap, and waited. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Maybe whoever had been here was long gone. Maybe I'd scared them off by staying put. I started to relax, convincing myself I'd overreacted. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were closer, coming from the direction of the stream. My heart pounded as I turned off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside my camp. Then came the dragging sound again. It was closer this time, and I could hear the scrape of something heavy being pulled across the ground. My hands shook as I gripped the knife. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. The sounds continued for what felt like an eternity, moving around the edge of my camp. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. Slowly, I turned my flashlight back on, shining it around the camp. Nothing. The tracks from the night before were still there, but no new ones. It was like whoever or whatever had been there didn't leave a trace. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I packed up my gear and started hiking back to the car. Every sound in the forest set my nerves on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. Relief washed over me as I threw my pack in the trunk and got behind the wheel. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something. I don't know what, and maybe I don't want to. It's been weeks since that trip, and I haven't been back to the woods. I still love the outdoors, but now there's a part of me that hesitates. That night, I realized something I'd always known but never fully understood. The wilderness isn't just beautiful, it's indifferent. And sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't nature, it's people. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wild, away from the city's noise and chaos, that makes me feel alive. The trip I'm about to recount, however, changed my perspective on what being alive truly means. This story isn't about ghosts or supernatural beings. It's about real danger, the kind you don't see coming until it's too late. It started as a solo trip. I needed a break from the monotony of my office job, so I packed my gear, loaded my truck, and headed for a remote area of the national forest about 4 hours from home. I'd done my research. The area wasn't too far off the beaten path, but it was secluded enough to promise a weekend of quiet reflection. I arrived mid-afternoon on a Friday. The forest greeted me with the familiar sense of pine and earth. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals going about their day. I found a flat clearing near a stream and set up my tent. The water was clear and cold, perfect for washing up later. After pitching the tent and securing my supplies, I gathered some firewood, careful not to stray too far. I wanted to keep the stream within earshot. By dusk, I had a fire going. I cooked a simple meal, beans and some canned stew. The crackling flames and the stars above made the world feel immense and peaceful. As the fire burned down, I crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling the weight of the week slip away. The forest was alive with sound. Crickets, the hoot of an owl, and the distant howl of a coyote. I drifted off quickly, content. The next morning, I woke with the sun. After breakfast and coffee, I decided to explore the area. I left markers along the trail with biodegradable tape, ensuring I could find my way back. The forest was dense but manageable, with well-worn animal trails that made walking easier. About an hour into my hike, I came across something unusual. An old, rusted hunting stand nailed high into a tree. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The ladder was rotting, and the platform above was partially collapsed. Still, it was a reminder that I wasn't the first person to wander here. I continued deeper into the woods, occasionally stopping to take photos or jot down notes in my journal. Around noon, I found a small meadow and decided it was a good place to rest and eat. As I sat on a fallen log, I noticed something that set me on edge. There were no birds. The forest, which had been so full of sound, was eerily quiet. I chalked it up to my imagination and finished my lunch quickly, deciding it was time to head back. Retracing my steps proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. The markers I'd left were harder to spot in the shifting light, and I realized I'd wandered farther than I thought. After an hour of walking, I felt a growing unease. The forest seemed different, as if it were closing in. The air felt heavier, and the silence was oppressive. I told myself to stay calm, that I'd find my way back soon, but the feeling of being watched was hard to shake. Finally, I stumbled back into familiar territory and found my camp. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I approached, I noticed something was off. The tent's flap was open, though I'd zipped it closed before leaving. My gear, which had been neatly stored, was scattered. My food bag hung from a tree branch to keep it safe from animals, but it was slashed open, the contents strewn across the ground. At first, I thought it might have been a bear or raccoon, but then I saw the footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. The soles had a distinct pattern I didn't recognize. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been here. Someone had rifled through my belongings while I was out in the woods. I did a quick inventory. My sleeping bag was still there, as were my clothes and first aid kit. But my knife was gone, along with a small flashlight and some of my food. My journal, which I'd left on a rock by the fire pit, was missing too. Panic bubbled up, but I forced myself to stay composed. Whoever had been here was likely long gone. Still, the thought of staying another night made my stomach churn. I decided to pack up and leave. As I hurriedly stuffed my gear into my backpack, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me freeze. The daylight, which had felt warm and inviting earlier, now seemed harsh and glaring. By the time I had everything packed, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The hike back to my truck was nerve-wracking. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone following me. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. My heart pounded with every step, and I found myself gripping a heavy branch I'd picked up as a makeshift weapon. When I finally saw the dirt road where my truck was parked, I nearly cried with relief. But my relief was short-lived. As I approached the truck, I saw the driver's side window was smashed. Glass littered the ground, and the door was ajar. Inside, the glove compartment was open, and its contents were strewn across the seat. My spare keys, which I'd hidden under the driver's seat, were gone. So was the small emergency kit I kept in the back. I stood there, stunned. My phone, which I'd left in the glove compartment to disconnect for the weekend, was gone too. I was completely cut off, stranded miles from the nearest town. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think. I couldn't stay here. Whoever had done this might still be nearby. I needed to move. I grabbed what I could carry and started walking down the dirt road. The sun had set by now, and the forest was cloaked in darkness. My flashlight cast a weak beam, barely cutting through the shadows. Every sound made me jump, and the miles seemed to stretch endlessly. I kept moving, driven by a mix of fear and determination. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance. A wave of relief washed over me as a pickup truck approached. I flagged it down, waving my arms frantically. The driver, an older man with a kind face, stopped and rolled down his window. "You all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. I quickly explained what had happened, leaving out no details. He nodded, his expression darkening. "You're lucky," he said. "These woods, they're not as empty as people think." He offered me a ride to the nearest town, and I gladly accepted. As we drove, he told me about other incidents in the area. Missing hikers, strange campsites found abandoned. "People don't talk about it much," he said, "but you're not the first to have a run-in out here." When we reached town, I reported the break-ins to the local sheriff. They took my statement but didn't seem hopeful about finding the culprit. "It's a big forest," one deputy said with a shrug, "and not everyone who wanders in comes out." I spent the night in a cheap motel, too shaken to sleep. The next day, I arranged for a tow truck to retrieve my vehicle. As I drove home, the events of the weekend replayed in my mind. The woods, once a place of solace, now felt like a reminder of how vulnerable we are when we're alone. I haven't been camping since. The gear I recovered sits untouched in my garage, gathering dust. I still love the idea of the outdoors, but the reality of that trip stays with me. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes it's not the animals you need to fear. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wild that clears my head. The cool air, the smell of the pines, the distant rustle of leaves. So when I had a free weekend, I decided to head to a remote spot in the mountains that a friend had mentioned. He described it as untouched, a little slice of nature that few people knew about. I packed my gear: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 2 days, and a few other essentials. I left my phone in the car. There wouldn't be any service where I was going, and besides, part of the appeal was disconnecting from everything. The drive up was uneventful. The narrow road twisted and turned, climbing steadily into the mountains. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was high in the sky. I parked, strapped on my backpack, and started hiking. The trail was rugged but beautiful, with tall trees lining the path and the occasional glimpse of distant peaks through the canopy. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. About 3 hours in, I reached the spot my friend had told me about, a small clearing by a stream. It was perfect. The stream babbled softly, and the trees around the clearing created a natural wall, making it feel secluded. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and sat down to eat a sandwich while taking in the scenery. By late afternoon, the temperature had started to drop. I gathered some firewood and built a small fire. As the flames flickered, I felt the kind of contentment that only comes from being far away from the noise of everyday life. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was a glittering blanket. I stared up, feeling small and peaceful all at once. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped up my sleeping bag. The sound of the stream was soothing, and I drifted off quickly. I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, just a rustling outside the tent. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but then I heard it again. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Something or someone was moving around out there. My heart started pounding. I lay still, straining to listen. The rustling grew louder, closer. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But then I heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I've never been the paranoid type, but in that moment, every worst-case scenario flashed through my mind. I hadn't seen another soul since I left the car. Who could possibly be out here? And why? I reached for the small knife I'd packed and gripped it tightly. My breathing was shallow, my pulse thundering in my ears. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I could hear whoever it was breathing. Low, steady breaths, and then silence. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, knife in hand, waiting. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Eventually, the footsteps started again, this time moving away from the tent. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then stayed awake for hours, straining to catch any other sound. None came. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked exactly as I'd left it, but the ground around my tent was disturbed. There were footprints, human footprints, leading from the trees to my tent and then back into the woods. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but another part, the stubborn part, refused to be scared off. This was my trip, and I wasn't going to let some weirdo ruin it. Besides, whoever it was had left, right? I spent the day exploring the area, trying to shake off the unease. But no matter how beautiful the scenery, I couldn't relax. I kept looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I decided to keep the fire going all night. It felt safer somehow. I sat by the flames, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Slowly, my nerves began to settle. Maybe it had been a fluke. Maybe it really was just another camper passing through. I convinced myself that I was overreacting. But then I noticed something. Just beyond the reach of the firelight, there was a shape, a dark silhouette standing among the trees. My stomach dropped. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but it was still there, motionless, watching. I stood up, knife in hand, and shouted, "Who's there?" My voice sounded shaky, even to me. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there for what felt like an eternity before slowly retreating into the darkness. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I doused the fire, packed packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started hiking back to the car. The trail was pitch black, and I had to use my flashlight to see. Every sound made me jump. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. It all felt amplified in the silence of the forest. About halfway to the trailhead, I heard it again. Footsteps. They weren't behind me but off to the side, keeping pace with me. I stopped and they stopped. I started walking again, faster this time, and so did they. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Finally, I saw the faint glimmer of my car through the trees. I broke into a run, not caring about the noise anymore. When I reached the car, I threw my gear into the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a few tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the mountain road, not looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main road, that I started to feel safe. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I've been camping countless times before and since, but I've never gone back to that spot. Whatever was out there, I'm just glad I got out when I did. I can still smell the damp earth and hear the faint crackle of the fire from that night. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend in the woods to escape the noise of the city. I've always found peace in the wilderness, the solitude, the stillness, the humbling vastness of it all. It's something I've sought for years. This trip was no different, or so I thought. I parked my car at the edge of a gravel road that cut through the forest. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. My pack was heavy, loaded with essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a first aid kit. I double-checked everything before heading down the trail. I'd chosen a spot deep in the forest, far from the designated camping areas. The idea was to be alone, away from the hum of RV generators and the chatter of fellow campers. I wanted to immerse myself in nature, to truly disconnect. The hike to the campsite took about 3 hours. The trail was narrow and winding, bordered by towering pines and clusters of ferns. The forest was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the occasional scamper of something small and unseen. It was comforting, like nature's own symphony. I felt at ease, my steps light as I navigated the uneven terrain. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I'd marked on my map. It was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a gentle slope leading down to a stream. The water was clear and cold, and I could see small fish darting between the rocks. I set up my tent on a patch of flat ground, taking care to clear away any sticks and stones. The fire pit came next, a simple ring of rocks with dry wood stacked neatly in the center. As the sun began to set, I lit the fire. The flames danced and crackled, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles and a can of beans, and ate in silence, listening to the forest around me. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. A twig snapping in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was nothing, just the normal noises of the forest. By the time the fire burned down to glowing embers, the sky was a blanket of stars. I crawled into my tent, zipping the flap closed behind me. My sleeping bag was warm and comforting, and I drifted off to sleep with the sound of the stream in my ears. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The tent was dark, and the forest was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses down on you, making you acutely aware of your own breathing. I lay still, straining to hear anything. A rustle, a chirp, a distant howl. Nothing. Then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves outside my tent. My first thought was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but these steps were heavier, more deliberate. They moved with purpose, circling the tent. My stomach tightened, and I held my breath, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I've always been cautious when camping. I carry bear spray and keep my food stored properly to avoid attracting wildlife. But this didn't feel like an animal. The footsteps paused, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Whoever or whatever it was standing just outside my tent. My mind raced. Should I call out? Pretend I'm not here? I reached for the knife I kept in my pack, gripping it tightly. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the tent. I waited until the sound faded completely before unzipping the flap, just enough to peek outside. The fire pit was dark, the clearing illuminated only by moonlight. I couldn't see anyone, but the unease lingered. I told myself it was probably a hiker who had stumbled upon my campsite. Maybe they didn't realize I was here and left when they figured it out. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound made me jump, and I kept the knife within reach. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent, bleary-eyed but relieved to see the sunlight. The forest felt different in the daylight, less intimidating. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I packed up my gear, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints circling my tent. They were fresh, pressed into the damp earth, and they definitely weren't mine. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who had been out here in the middle of the night, and why had they been circling my tent? I decided to cut the trip short. The thought of spending another night out here made my skin crawl. I hoisted my pack and started back down the trail, my senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway back to the car, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. A piece of red fabric snagged on a branch. It looked like part of a shirt or jacket, torn and weathered. It wasn't mine, and I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. My stomach churned as I realized it could belong to the person who had been outside my tent. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. By the time I reached my car, I was out of breath, my shirt soaked with sweat. I threw my pack into the trunk and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the gravel road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. When I finally made it home, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but the experience stayed with me. For weeks, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints or the sound of those deliberate footsteps outside my tent. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a lost hiker. Maybe it was something more sinister. All I know is that I've never felt truly alone in the woods since. It had been months since I last ventured into the wilderness. Work, city life, and the constant hum of technology had consumed my days, leaving me yearning for a quiet escape. With a long weekend ahead, I packed my gear and set off on a solo camping trip to the remote woods of northern Vermont, a place I'd been to countless times before, but this time felt different. The forest was alive as I hiked deeper into its heart. The tall pines towered above me, their dark silhouettes stretching against the fading light of evening. The air was cool, and the scent of pine needles filled my lungs. It was peaceful, serene, at least for a while. I reached my usual campsite, a small clearing near a babbling brook. The spot had always been perfect. A flat area for my tent, a sturdy fire ring, and the soothing sound of water nearby. I set up camp quickly, my hands moving with practiced ease. It had become second nature, tent first, then firewood, water filtration, food supplies. Everything was methodical, a rhythm I had perfected through many trips. As night fell, the forest grew quieter. The birds and insects that had serenaded me earlier were now silent, leaving a heavy stillness behind. My campfire crackled as I added a few more logs, the flames flickering against the dark trees. I sat back in my camping chair, warming my hands, the rhythmic popping of the fire a comforting companion. That's when I heard it, a sound low and indistinct, almost like a whisper in the wind. My breath caught, and I sat up straighter. I strained my ears, but there was nothing, just the usual symphony of crickets and distant rustling leaves. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest settling into the night. Yet the feeling that something was off lingered in my chest. I spent the next hour tending the fire, listening for anything unusual. The forest seemed normal, the familiar rustle of creatures moving through the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. Still, a knot of unease settled deeper in my stomach, and no matter how I tried to shake it, it wouldn't go away. Around midnight, I decided to turn in for the night. The cool air wrapped around me as I zipped up my tent, settling onto my sleeping bag. The fire crackled softly outside, its warmth fading with the hours. I lay there, staring up at the dark roof of the tent, the sounds of the forest acting as a lullaby. But sleep never came. Instead, I lay awake, my thoughts racing. That strange sound from earlier replayed in my mind over and over. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a figment of my imagination, or perhaps the wind playing tricks on me. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Just as I was about to drift off, the unmistakable snap of a branch echoed nearby. I froze. It wasn't close enough to my campsite to pinpoint exactly where, but it was close enough to make my heart skip a beat. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then, a slow crunching sound began, something walking. It wasn't an animal, though. It was deliberate, measured, heavy yet somehow deliberate. I felt my pulse quicken. I reached out blindly for my flashlight, fumbling in the dark, heart pounding in my ears. The sound moved closer, stopping for moments, then continuing again. I could hear faint breathing between each step, a shallow, steady inhale and exhale. Whoever or whatever it was there right outside my tent. My fingers found the flashlight. I flicked it on, the beam piercing through the darkness like a blade. The forest outside appeared calm through the lens, but I could still hear the faint breathing. I shined the light around, sweeping the beam across the clearing, hoping to catch a glimpse of what or who was there. Nothing. The forest was empty, but the footsteps continued. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. The fire had long died down, leaving my campsite in near total darkness. The only sounds were the faint rustle of leaves and the steady echo of footsteps. My flashlight beam was steady, but the glow seemed powerless against the suffocating night. Suddenly, a voice, low and raspy, spoke in the dark. "Why are you here?" It wasn't loud, but it was close, too close. My breath caught and I couldn't move. I stayed paralyzed, the flashlight shaking in my hand, the beam trembling against the vast nothingness. No answer came from me. The voice spoke again, this time louder, more urgent. "What do you want?" I couldn't find my voice. My chest felt tight, and my mind raced through all the possibilities. This wasn't some campfire ghost story or the blur of dream-induced hallucinations. This was real, and whatever it was outside my tent wasn't going away. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then resumed, circling my tent. I could hear them in the dirt, heavy and deliberate, yet still impossible to see. "Leave," I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse with fear. "Please." The voice let out a low, guttural laugh. It was not human, not entirely. It echoed around the clearing, bouncing off the trees and filling the empty space between the woods. "Why should I leave?" it said, as if amused by my plea. "This is my home." I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping this would end, that I would wake up in my bed in the city. But the darkness persisted. The flashlight flickered, then went out. I was left in total blackness once again, with only my breath and the sound of footsteps to remind me of the horror outside my tent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn broke through the forest, the woods returned to their natural quiet. The sounds of the night, the footsteps, the voice were gone. My body trembled uncontrollably, and my mind was still racing through the terror of the night. I emerged from my tent slowly, cautiously, expecting to see something, anything left behind. But the campsite was empty. Not a single trace of the previous night's events. No footprints, no sound. Only the cold, eerie stillness remained, and the memory of something I hoped to never encounter again. It started like any other camping trip. My friends and I had been planning this for weeks, an escape into the heart of the wilderness. We were tired of the city, the constant buzz of traffic, and the artificial lights that never seemed to dim. The thought of trees towering overhead and the sound of a crackling campfire was enough to lure us deep into the forest. We chose a spot a few miles into the woods, away from any marked trails. Our gear was packed: tents, sleeping bags, food, and a portable stove. The plan was simple: set up camp, spend a couple of days hiking, and return refreshed. Nothing about this seemed unusual at first, and honestly, we welcomed the break from modern life. As we arrived, the forest welcomed us with its quiet embrace. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. The occasional bird call punctuated the stillness, creating a symphony of nature. We split up the tasks. Alex and Jake set up the tents while Sophie and I started gathering firewood. It wasn't long before the campsite was established, our makeshift home in the woods. Night fell swiftly, and with it, a chill seeped into the air. We huddled around the fire, sharing stories and laughing about our day. The flames flickered and cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. For a while, it was peaceful, but that peace didn't last. It started subtly, a rustling in the underbrush just beyond the campsite. At first, we brushed it off as an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. Yet, the sounds grew more distinct, more deliberate. A twig snapped somewhere far off, followed by another. My senses heightened, and I glanced at my friends. They had noticed too. "I think we're not alone," Alex murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie shifted uneasily, hugging her knees. Jake stayed quiet, scanning the darkness around us. My pulse quickened, and I realized I had no explanation for what we were hearing. Whatever it wasn't wildlife. It felt human, deliberate, and unsettling. The night passed slowly. Each sound became sharper, more distinct. A crackling branch, a whispered word carried by the wind. We took turns watching over the campsite, never fully able to relax. There were no more stories, no more laughter, just the constant awareness that something was out there watching. The next day, we decided to push forward, away from the campsite. Maybe we'd find clarity or simply escape whatever had been lurking around us. We packed our day packs and set off on a trail that snaked through the woods. The hike was tense, and the atmosphere remained heavy. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow seemed to carry the weight of something unseen. Sophie kept looking over her shoulder, her voice trembling with each word. "Do you hear that? It's getting louder." Jake and Alex exchanged uneasy glances, but none of us had an answer. We pressed on, hoping to distance ourselves from whatever was following us. The trees grew denser as we moved deeper into the forest. The sun struggled to pierce the thick canopy above, casting strange patterns on the forest floor. Despite the beauty, an ominous sense of isolation enveloped us. The sound of running water reached us, a river. We decided to follow its course, hoping it would lead us out of the forest. The river was a brief respite from the oppressive stillness. The current was swift, and the water cool against our skin as we splashed through it. But even here, deep within nature's embrace, we felt eyes on us. Maybe we should head back, Alex suggested after a few hours of walking alongside the river. No, I said firmly. We're too far in now. Turning back would only bring us closer to whatever's out there. Sophie nodded reluctantly, and we kept moving. The forest seemed to shift as we walked. A subtle change in the air, the way the shadows shifted with each step. Felt like the very woods were alive, watching, waiting. Around midday, we stumbled upon an old, crumbling cabin. It was hidden behind a thicket of overgrown bushes and tangled roots. The windows were broken, the roof partially caved in. The air around the cabin felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of decay. We paused, unsure of what to make of it. We could rest here, Jake suggested, his voice laced with hesitation. Just for a little while. Sophie and I exchanged uneasy glances, but the idea of staying out in the open didn't sit well either. We reluctantly stepped inside the cabin. The inside was dusty and dark, with a faint, musty smell. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. We sat in silence for a while, each of us lost in our thoughts. The outside world seemed far away, the forest pressing in against the broken walls, holding us in. Time lost meaning, and it was hard to tell how long we had been there. Suddenly, we heard the faintest of whispers. Too quiet to make out words, but enough to make us freeze. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned to my friends. Their eyes mirrored my own fear. "We have to get out," Sophie whispered frantically. The decision was made in seconds. We packed up what little we had and bolted out of the cabin. The forest seemed darker than before, the shadows more menacing. The whispers continued, weaving around us, surrounding us with an eerie intimacy. It felt like the trees themselves were closing in. Hours passed, though it felt like mere moments. We rushed aimlessly, desperate to escape the haunting presence that had wrapped around us. Eventually, the sounds faded into nothingness, the forest once again becoming silent, save for the distant hum of the river. Exhausted and drained, we reached a clearing. The sun set behind us, casting a faint glow on the horizon. We collapsed on the ground, the weight of the day pressing down on us. The tension began to ease, but the unease lingered. "We made it," Jake said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "We made it," I repeated, though the words felt hollow. We didn't talk much after that. The hike back to our campsite was uneventful, the woods no longer feeling alive with unseen watchers. When we finally returned to the tents, we packed up without a word. The desire to get out of the forest was overwhelming. As we stepped out into the open, the city lights welcomed us back, but the forest's quiet whisper still echoed in our minds. It wasn't something we could forget, a memory carved into our bones, a haunting we could never shake. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I'd been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks, craving a break from the constant noise of city life. The plan was simple: drive out to a remote area, set up camp, and spend a few days hiking and relaxing in the wilderness. I picked a spot far from the usual crowded campsites, a small clearing in the woods I'd stumbled across online. The reviews were scarce, but the pictures showed a serene, untouched stretch of forest with a narrow stream cutting through it. It looked perfect. The drive out was uneventful. The roads became narrower and less maintained the farther I went. By the time I turned onto the final dirt road, my GPS signal was long gone. The isolation was exactly what I'd hoped for. After an hour of bumping along the rutted trail, I found the clearing. It was as picturesque as the photos had promised, maybe even better. Towering pines surrounded the space, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. The stream, clear and cold, wound lazily along the edge of the clearing. I parked my car off to the side and got to work setting up camp. It didn't take long to pitch my tent and arrange my gear. I even had time to gather some wood for a small fire before the sun began to set. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As the sky turned from orange to deep blue, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and listening to the forest sounds. Crickets chirped, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals moving in the underbrush. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early the next morning, eager to explore. With a map and compass in hand, I planned a loop hike that would take me up a nearby ridge and back down to the stream. The trail was faint, barely more than a game path, but it was easy enough to follow. The climb was steep in places, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath. Each time I paused, I'd take in the view. Endless trees stretching in every direction, broken only by the distant shimmer of a lake. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was high in the sky, and I was starving. I made a quick lunch and spent the afternoon lounging by the stream, letting the cold water soothe my sore feet. As the sun dipped lower, I built another fire and prepared for the night. The sense of tranquility I'd felt the day before was still there, but it was tinged with something else. A faint unease I couldn't quite place. I chalked it up to being alone in such an isolated place. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. The second night was different. I woke up sometime after midnight, unsure of what had roused me. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the outline of my tent. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The usual background hum of insects was gone. I lay still, straining to hear anything. That's when I noticed it. A faint sound, like footsteps, coming from the woods. At first, I told myself it was an animal. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. They moved slowly, stopping and starting as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. My heart began to race. I sat up, careful not to make any noise. The footsteps seemed to circle the clearing, staying just out of sight. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees beyond the fire. Nothing. No movement, no eyes reflecting the light. I stayed awake for hours, listening. The footsteps didn't return, but the sense of being watched lingered. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent, exhausted and jumpy. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, peaceful and undisturbed. I told myself it had been my imagination, a trick of the dark and my tired mind. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to stay close to camp that day. I gathered more firewood, checked my gear, and spent some time fishing in the stream. The hours passed slowly, each small sound putting me on edge. By the time evening came, I was ready to leave. I packed up most of my gear, leaving only the tent and essentials for the night. I planned to head out first thing in the morning. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they were louder, closer. I stayed in the tent, gripping the flashlight and a small camping knife. My heart pounded so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I held my breath, waiting. Then, a shadow passed across the thin fabric of the tent wall. It was human-shaped, tall and broad. The figure lingered for a moment before moving on, the footsteps receding into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I broke camp and loaded everything into the car. The drive back to the main road felt interminable. Every bump and shadow made me flinch, but I didn't see anyone. When I finally reached the highway, I felt a wave of relief. Back home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it had been a hunter or another camper, though I hadn't seen any signs of other people. Whoever it was, they hadn't tried to harm me, but their presence was enough to ruin the trip. I haven't been camping alone since. The memory of those footsteps, circling in the dark, is enough to keep me close to home. Camping alone had always been a calming escape for me. The solitude, the absence of modern distractions, and the humbling presence of nature allowed me to reset and refocus. That weekend, I had decided to explore a less frequented area of the Green Mountains in Vermont. It was early October, and the foliage was breathtaking. A fiery blend of oranges, yellows, and reds. The trail I chose was unmarked, a faint path locals had mentioned but wasn't on any official maps. That made it perfect for some quiet reflection. I parked my car at the base of a dirt road, well off the beaten path. From there, I hiked for about 6 hours into the woods. The trail wasn't obvious in some spots, but I'd brought a topographic map and a GPS. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing beside a stream. The place seemed ideal for setting up camp. The water source was close, and the clearing was surrounded by tall pines that blocked most of the wind. Setting up camp took about an hour. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground, gathered some firewood, and made a small fire. Dinner was a simple freeze-dried meal, nothing fancy but enough to fill me up. As the sun set, the temperature dropped significantly. I wrapped myself in my jacket and sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of burning wood and the gentle babble of the stream. It felt perfect, peaceful and disconnected from the world. The first sign of something being off came just after dusk. I heard a distant rustling in the woods. At first, I dismissed it as wildlife. Deer and other animals were common in these parts, and the sound wasn't unusual. But the rustling continued, growing closer and more deliberate. I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the fire, and shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound revealed nothing but trees. Still, it left me feeling uneasy. I decided to stoke the fire and make it brighter, figuring a larger flame might keep animals at bay. The noise stopped for a while, and I chalked it up to my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the hours crept on, I retreated to my tent, zipping it up tightly and keeping my flashlight and knife within reach. Around midnight, I woke up abruptly. At first, I didn't know why. The fire outside had died down to embers, and the air inside the tent was cold. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving carefully, almost cautiously. The steps were too heavy to belong to an animal. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, as the footsteps stopped right outside my tent. My mind raced. I hadn't seen another person since I started my hike. Who could possibly be out here and why? I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly in one hand while holding my flashlight in the other. Then, without warning, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I lay awake for hours, listening for any sound, but the forest had gone eerily silent. By dawn, I was exhausted but determined to stay cautious. I stepped outside my tent, knife in hand, and scanned the area. There were footprints in the dirt around my campsite. They were large and human. My stomach churned at the realization. Whoever had been there wasn't trying to hide their presence. The thought made me uneasy. I quickly packed up my gear, deciding to cut the trip short and head back to my car. The hike back felt different. The woods, which had seemed serene and welcoming on the way in, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The trail, already faint, seemed harder to follow on the way back. Several times, I had to stop and check my map and GPS to make sure I was on the right path. About halfway back, I came across something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a tree branch was a small bundle of sticks tied together with a piece of frayed rope. It looked deliberate, almost like some kind of marker or warning. The rope was weathered but recently placed. I took a photo with my phone, not sure why, and then hurried past it. As I continued, I noticed more of these bundles, each one slightly different but all tied with the same type of rope. They appeared at irregular intervals, always just off the trail. I couldn't make sense of them, but their presence unnerved me. Someone had been out here recently, and they'd gone to considerable effort to leave these behind. The final stretch of the hike felt endless. By the time I reached the dirt road where I'd parked, the sun was starting to set. Relief washed over me as I spotted my car. But as I approached, I noticed something was wrong. The back window had been smashed, and the doors were unlocked. My heart sank. I checked inside and found that my emergency supplies, a first aid kit, extra food, and a blanket were missing. The rest of my belongings, including the car's registration and a few personal items, were untouched. It felt like a message, though I couldn't decipher what it meant. I didn't waste any time. I started the car and drove back toward civilization as quickly as the rough dirt road allowed. Every so often, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road. It wasn't until I reached a small town and found a gas station that I began to feel safe. I reported the incident to the local authorities, showing them the photos of the footprints and the strange bundles I'd found. The officer I spoke to took my statement but didn't seem overly concerned. Could have been some kids messing around, he said, but I knew better. The deliberate nature of the bundles and the calculated way the person had moved around my camp didn't feel like a prank. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what their intentions were. I've gone camping many times since, but I'm much more cautious now. I stick to well-traveled trails and established campgrounds, and I always let someone know exactly where I'm going. The woods are beautiful, but they're also vast and unpredictable. That trip was a stark reminder that while nature can be serene, it's not the only thing you need to be wary of out there. It all started as a weekend getaway. The idea was simple: escape the noise of the city, spend a couple of nights in the wilderness, and come back feeling refreshed. I'd done it before and I knew the routine. Pack light but smart, carry enough food and water, and make sure to let someone know where you're going. This time, I picked a remote spot in a national forest about 3 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a well-known camping area, which was part of the appeal. No crowded trails or noisy groups, just me, the trees, and the sounds of nature. The drive out there was uneventful. I had my gear in the back of my SUV, a playlist of old rock songs keeping me company, and the kind of excitement that comes from knowing you're about to disconnect from everything. The roads got narrower the closer I got to the forest, eventually turning into a dirt path with potholes and overgrown bushes scraping the sides of the car. It wasn't anything I hadn't handled before, but it did remind me how isolated this spot was. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low in the sky, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. I found a clearing about half a mile from the main trail. It was surrounded by tall pines, with a small stream nearby. Perfect. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and started setting up camp. The tent went up smoothly, and I had a small fire going just as the last bit of daylight faded. Dinner was a simple affair. A can of chili heated over the fire and a granola bar for dessert. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames and listening to the sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. When I finally crawled into my tent, I felt that deep kind of peace that only comes when you're far away from everything. I drifted off to sleep easily, the cool night air and the soft sounds of the forest lulling me into a deep rest. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early, made myself some coffee, and spent the morning exploring the area around my camp. The forest was beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the trees and the air crisp and fresh. I followed the stream for a while, spotting a couple of deer in the distance and even a fox darting through the underbrush. By midday, I'd worked up an appetite and returned to camp for lunch. That's when I noticed something odd. My backpack, which I'd left inside the tent, was unzipped. At first, I thought I'd forgotten to close it, but as I checked my things, I realized some of my food was missing. It wasn't much, just a couple of energy bars and a small bag of trail mix, but it was strange. There were no signs of an animal getting into the tent, no rips or claw marks. It looked like someone had carefully unzipped it and taken the food. I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd been careless and left the tent open, and a raccoon or something had snuck in. I zipped everything up tightly this time and went about my day. The afternoon was uneventful. I read a book by the fire, took a short nap, and started preparing dinner as the sun began to set. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The forest felt different. The usual sounds were there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that the strange incident with the backpack had put me on edge. But every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a noise, a twig snapping, a rustle in the bushes, and my eyes would snap open. I stayed in my sleeping bag, straining my ears, but nothing ever came close to the tent. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found more signs that something wasn't right. The firewood I'd gathered the day before was scattered around the clearing, as if someone had kicked it. My water bottle, which I'd left by the fire pit, was gone. I searched the area but couldn't find it. It was unsettling, to say the least. I started to wonder if someone else was out here, messing with me. But why? This spot was so remote that the chances of running into another camper were slim. And even if someone else was out here, what kind of person sneaks into someone's camp just to take a water bottle and some snacks? I decided to pack up and leave. The trip wasn't worth the growing sense of unease. As I started breaking down my tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt around the clearing. Not boot prints like you'd expect from a hiker, but bare footprints. They were faint, but they were definitely human. I wasn't alone out here. I hurried to get my gear into the car, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt oppressive now, the tall trees seeming to close in around me. As I loaded the last of my things, I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was too deep, too deliberate. My hands shook as I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The drive back down the dirt road was nerve-wracking. I kept expecting something to step out from the trees or to see someone in my rearview mirror. But the road remained empty, and I finally made it to the highway. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. Looking back, I can't say for sure what happened out there. Maybe it was some kind of prank, or maybe someone really was living in those woods, taking what they needed from unsuspecting campers. Either way, it was enough to make me think twice about camping alone again. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. You never really know what's out there watching. It started as a weekend trip to clear my head. Work had been relentless, and I hadn't taken a real break in months. I decided to head out to a remote area I'd read about online, a place where the mountains were high, the trees were dense, and the cell phone reception was non-existent. It sounded perfect. No distractions, just me, my tent, and the wilderness. I packed my gear meticulously. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for freezing temperatures, enough food for 3 days, and a small first aid kit. My pack felt heavy, but I was used to it. Hiking was something I'd always loved, though it had been a while since I'd ventured out this far. The trailhead was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and by the time I parked, the late afternoon sun was already casting long shadows. The trail started out easy, winding gently through the forest. The crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional chirp of birds were the only sounds. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a combination that always brought me a sense of calm. As I climbed higher, the trees grew denser, their trunks thicker, and the underbrush more tangled. The trail became steeper, and I found myself stopping more often to catch my breath. Still, I felt good. This was exactly what I needed. By the time I reached the spot I'd marked on my map as a good camping site, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The clearing was small but flat, surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the breeze. A stream gurgled nearby, its sound soothing against the quiet of the forest. I set up my tent quickly, using the last light of day, then gathered some wood for a small fire. As the flames flickered, I ate a quick dinner of instant noodles and jerky. The warmth of the fire and the food in my stomach made me feel content, almost sleepy. The night was cold, colder than I'd expected for this time of year. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. First, it was peaceful. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But as the night deepened, I began to notice other sounds. A crack of a branch here, the crunch of leaves there. It was probably just animals, I told myself. A deer or maybe a raccoon scavenging. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. The next morning, I woke early, eager to explore. I left my tent and most of my gear behind, taking only a small day pack with water, snacks, and a map. The trail I'd planned to follow wasn't well marked, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to get off the beaten path, to feel like I was truly in the wild. The morning air was crisp, and the forest seemed alive with movement. Birds flitted between branches, and I even spotted a fox darting across the trail ahead of me. As I climbed higher, the trail became less defined. I had to rely on my map and compass to stay on course. Around midday, I stopped for a break at a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the valley below. The forest stretched out in all directions, a sea of green under a cloudless sky. It was beautiful, but also a little daunting. Out here, I was completely alone. If something went wrong, there was no one to help. I ate a granola bar, drank some water, and studied the map. I'd planned to loop back toward my campsite, but the terrain ahead looked challenging. Steep slopes, dense forest. I debated turning back, but decided to push on. The whole point of this trip was to challenge myself, to get out of my comfort zone. The trail grew harder to follow. At times, it seemed to disappear entirely, and I had to navigate by landmarks. A distinctive rock formation, a cluster of unusually tall trees. The forest felt different here. The trees were older, their trunks massive and gnarled. The underbrush was thicker, and the air seemed heavier, as if the forest itself was watching me. By late afternoon, I realized I'd lost the trail completely. I wasn't panicked, yet I had my map, my compass, and a good sense of direction. I could backtrack if I needed to. Still, the thought of spending another night out here, away from my tent and supplies, was not appealing. As I tried to find my way back, I noticed things I hadn't before, small details that seemed off. A tree with deep gouges in its bark, too high up to be the work of any animal I could think of. A pile of stones arranged in a way that didn't look natural. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was reading too much into ordinary things. The sun was setting when I finally admitted I was lost. The light was fading fast, and the forest was growing darker by the minute. I found a relatively flat spot and decided to make camp for the night. I didn't have a tent, but I used my emergency blanket to create a makeshift shelter. It wasn't much, but it would keep me warm. That night, the sounds came again, louder this time and closer. The crack of branches, the rustle of underbrush. It wasn't the wind. I was sure of that. I lay there, heart pounding, every muscle tensed. Something was out there. Couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. When morning came, I packed up quickly and started moving. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get out of the forest. I headed downhill, reasoning that I'd eventually hit a road or a river that would lead me to safety. The terrain was rough, and I stumbled more than once, scraping my hands and knees. But I kept going, driven by a growing sense of urgency. Around midday, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was a campsite, but not mine. The tent was torn, its fabric hanging in shreds. Gear was scattered everywhere, some of it broken. A sleeping bag lay crumpled on the ground, dark stains marring the fabric. I didn't stay to investigate. Whatever had happened here, I didn't want to know. I moved as quickly as I could, my mind racing. What had happened at that campsite? Was it an animal or something worse? The forest seemed different now, more oppressive. Every shadow looked like a threat, every sound like something coming for me. By late afternoon, I reached a stream. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to a larger body of water or a road. My legs were aching and my stomach growled, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see something, someone, following me. But the forest remained empty. As the sun set, I spotted something ahead, a bridge. It was old and rickety, but it meant I was close to civilization. I crossed it carefully, my heart pounding with relief. On the other side, the forest began to thin, and I saw the faint outline of a road. When I finally stepped onto the asphalt, I almost cried. A truck appeared a few minutes later, and the driver stopped when he saw me. I must have looked terrible, dirty, scratched up, and clearly shaken. He didn't ask many questions, just offered me a ride back to town. I didn't argue. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened out there. I haven't told anyone about the campsite I found, or the sounds I heard at night. I've replayed it all in my head, trying to make sense of it, but I keep coming up empty. All I know is that something was out there, and I'm lucky to have made it out. Camping has always been my go-to way to disconnect from the hustle of life. The rhythm of the woods, the smell of pine, the crackling fire, all of it felt like an antidote to the city's noise. So when a long weekend lined up with some good weather, I didn't hesitate. I packed my gear, loaded my car, and drove out to a remote spot in the national forest I'd been eyeing on a map for months. The drive itself was uneventful. Long stretches of winding roads gave way to gravel paths that snaked deeper into the wilderness. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was still high, casting dappled light through the trees. I parked, slung on my heavy pack, and started the hike to a clearing I'd marked on my GPS. It was supposed to be secluded, near a stream, and far from any popular trails. Exactly what I wanted. The hike took about 3 hours. The trail started wide but gradually narrowed as I veered off onto an unmarked path. It was clear no one had been through recently. Overgrown bushes snagged at my clothes, and I had to sidestep fallen branches and rocks. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. Occasionally, I'd hear the chatter of birds or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It felt right, like I was stepping into another world, one untouched by humans. When I reached the clearing, it was everything I hoped for. A small meadow opened up, surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the breeze. The stream I'd read about trickled nearby, its water clear and cold. I dropped my pack, stretched my aching shoulders, and set up camp. My tent went up quickly, a small 2-person shelter that had seen its share of adventures. I gathered rocks to circle a fire pit, collected dry wood, and started a fire. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the camp was ready, and I was sitting by the fire, eating a meal out of a pouch and watching the stars emerge. The first night was peaceful. The fire crackled softly, and the distant hoot of an owl occasionally punctuated the stillness. I crawled into my sleeping bag feeling content, the kind of deep satisfaction that only comes from a day well spent in nature. The forest felt alive yet calm, a presence that wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. The next day, I explored the area. The stream led to a small waterfall about a mile away, and I spent hours there, basking in the cool mist and taking photos. I saw deer tracks near the water, found a patch of wildflowers, and even spotted a hawk circling overhead. It was the kind of day that reminded me why I loved the outdoors so much. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already dipping low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. That evening, as I sat by the fire, something shifted. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a vague feeling, like being watched. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my imagination. After all, I was alone in the wilderness. It was natural to feel a little on edge, but as the night deepened, the feeling grew. The forest, which had felt so welcoming the night before, now seemed different. The usual rustling of leaves and distant animal sounds felt closer, more deliberate. I tried to focus on the fire, poking at it with a stick to keep it going. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows on the trees. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, someone, standing there. But there was nothing, just the dark outlines of trees and the faint silver light of the moon filtering through the canopy. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes jolted me awake. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons, maybe a deer, but the unease lingered. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. The daylight made everything seem normal again. The forest was just the forest, and I laughed at myself for being so jumpy. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling entirely. I decided to stay close to camp that day, gathering more firewood and doing some light fishing in the stream. I kept my knife within reach, more out of habit than actual fear, or so I told myself. The day passed quietly, and by the time the sun began to set, I was feeling more like myself. I built a larger fire that night, its flames roaring as if to push back the darkness. But the unease returned as soon as night fell. This time it was stronger, more insistent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sounds in the forest seemed too deliberate, too human. Footsteps? No, it couldn't be. The rational part of my brain insisted it was animals, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But another part of me, the instinctual part that had kept humans alive for thousands of years, screamed that something was wrong. I stayed by the fire, clutching my knife and straining my ears. Hours passed like this, the fire dwindling as the night dragged on. Then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep into the sky, I heard it. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. It was close, too close. My heart pounded as I stared into the trees, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. And then I saw it, a shape just at the edge of the clearing. It was a person. They stood there, motionless, half hidden by the shadows. My throat went dry, and my grip on the knife tightened. Who were they? What did they want? I called out, my voice shaking, but they didn't respond. Instead, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest without a sound. I didn't wait to find out more. As soon as the sun was fully up, I packed my gear as fast as I could. My hands trembled as I stuffed my tent into its bag and doused the fire. The hike back to my car was a blur. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was drenched in sweat and completely exhausted. When I finally got back to my car, I locked the doors and sat there for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. I never figured out who that person was or what they were doing so deep in the woods. Maybe it was another camper, maybe a hunter, or maybe someone who had no business being there at all. I'll never know. But one thing's for sure, I'll think twice before camping alone again. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wild, away from the constant noise and chaos of daily life, that just feels right. The crackle of a campfire, the smell of pine trees, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. It's like hitting a reset button. So when I got a rare weekend off work, I decided to head out alone for a couple of nights in the woods. I'd done solo trips before and felt comfortable enough to handle myself. I chose a spot about an hour's drive from my place. It wasn't a popular campsite, just a patch of wilderness with a few trails and a river nearby, perfect for some peace and quiet. The plan was to hike a few miles in, set up camp, and spend the weekend fishing, reading, and enjoying the solitude. I packed light but made sure I had the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a small cooking kit, some dried food, water purification tablets, and a first aid kit. I also brought a small hatchet for firewood and my trusty knife, which I always carried when camping. Before leaving, I let my friend know where I'd be and when to expect me back, a habit I never skipped. The drive was uneventful, and I reached the trailhead around mid-morning. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a slight chill in the air, and no sign of rain. I parked my car, shouldered my backpack, and started hiking. The trail wound through dense forest, and the further I went, the quieter it became. After about 2 hours, I found a nice clearing near the river. It was flat, sheltered by tall trees, and had a good view of the water. Setting up camp didn't take long. I pitched my tent on a dry patch of ground, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. By early afternoon, I was sitting by the river with my fishing rod, soaking up the calm. The fish weren't biting much, but I didn't mind. Just being out there was enough. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, I cooked a simple dinner over the fire. The woods were starting to come alive with the sounds of night: crickets chirping, frogs croaking, and the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt a deep sense of contentment as I sat by the fire, sipping on a cup of tea and watching the flames dance. When the fire began to die down, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and drifted off to sleep. The first night passed without incident. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the trees and the sound of birds chirping. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the river upstream, keeping an eye out for anything interesting. The forest felt alive, and I took my time, enjoying the sights and sounds. Around midday, I came across something odd. It was a small pile of rocks, carefully stacked in a clearing near the river. It didn't look like a natural formation. Someone had arranged them deliberately. I'd seen things like this before on hiking trails. Sometimes people built cairns to mark a path or as a sort of art. But this one felt out of place. It was too far off the trail, and there were no signs of recent foot traffic in the area. Still, I didn't think much of it and continued on my way. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. I spent the rest of the day fishing and reading, occasionally glancing at the forest around me. There was a slight unease in the back of my mind, but I brushed it off. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. The woods can play tricks on your mind when you're alone. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought I heard something in the distance. It was faint, almost like a whistle or a hum. I paused, straining to hear, but it stopped. Probably just the wind or some animal, I thought. But as I got ready to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone out there. The second night was different. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was faint at first, a soft rustling like something moving through the underbrush. My heart started pounding as I lay there, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound grew louder, closer. I reached for my flashlight and knife, every nerve in my body on edge. When I finally mustered the courage to unzip the tent and shine my light outside, there was nothing there. The forest was still, almost unnaturally quiet. I scanned the area but saw no signs of movement. After a while, I convinced myself it was just a deer or some other animal passing through and crawled back into my tent. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of my campsite, the ground was disturbed. There were scuff marks in the dirt, like someone had been walking around. But the prints were strange. Too large to be human and oddly spaced, almost as if whoever or whatever made them had been moving on all fours. I'd seen animal tracks before, but these didn't match anything I recognized. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I kept busy, gathering firewood and fishing, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. By the time evening rolled around, I was questioning whether I should stay another night. As darkness fell, I built a larger fire than usual, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. I sat with my back to the flames, facing the forest, knife in hand. Hours passed, and the woods seemed to close in around me. The usual nighttime sounds were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then I heard it again, the rustling, closer this time. My pulse quickened as I strained to see beyond the firelight. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was low to the ground, moving quickly and silently. I froze, gripping my knife tightly. The figure stopped just outside the circle of light, and for a moment we both stayed perfectly still. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it darted back into the darkness. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the fire, knife in hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning finally came, I wasted no time packing up. I left the campsite as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder as I hiked back to the trailhead. The feeling of being watched never left me. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted but relieved to be out of those woods. I don't know what I encountered out there. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But those tracks and the way the figure moved didn't feel natural. I haven't been camping alone since that trip, and I don't think I ever will again. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else, and the woods were always a backdrop to our lives. They were the kind of place you could explore as a kid, finding little trails and streams, but as you got older, you realized they were also vast and lonely. It's where I decided to spend a weekend camping, mostly to clear my head and get away from the noise of everyday life. I'd always enjoyed being out in nature. The stillness, the quiet that wasn't silence but a chorus of leaves rustling and distant bird calls. The plan was simple. Hike out to a secluded spot I'd found on a map, set up camp, and spend a couple of nights away from everything. I'd packed everything carefully: a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and a small camping stove. My backpack was heavy, but I felt prepared. The spot I was heading to was deep in the forest, about a 10-mile hike from the nearest parking lot. It was near a small lake, surrounded by dense trees. Perfect, I thought, for some solitude. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The trail was well marked, and the weather was cool and pleasant. As I got deeper into the woods, the trail became less distinct, but I had a map and a compass, so I wasn't worried. I followed a narrow path that wound through tall pines and crossed a shallow stream. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached the lake. It was exactly as I'd hoped, serene and undisturbed. The water was so clear I could see the rocky bottom near the shore. I set up my tent a little way back from the water, on a flat patch of ground shaded by trees. That first night, I fell asleep to the sound of the lake gently lapping against the shore. The air was cool but not cold, and the forest around me felt alive but not threatening. I woke up once during the night to the sound of an owl hooting somewhere in the distance. It felt peaceful, almost comforting. By morning, I was ready to explore the area a bit more. I planned to hike around the lake, maybe do some fishing if I found a good spot. As the day went on, I noticed something odd. The forest felt different. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a sense that the woods were quieter than they had been the day before. The birdsong was less frequent, and the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush seemed to have faded. I told myself it was just my imagination or maybe the time of day. Still, the silence felt heavier as the afternoon wore on. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to head back to camp. I'd made it about halfway around the lake, and I was starting to feel a little uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly, just a nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. As I walked, I noticed tracks on the trail. At first, I thought they might be from another hiker, but the prints were too large and spaced too far apart. They looked like they belonged to an animal, maybe a bear, though I wasn't sure. I'd seen bear tracks before, but these seemed off somehow. I decided to pick up my pace. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was starting to dip below the trees. I felt a little better being back by the lake, but the unease lingered. I made dinner, trying to focus on the simple task of cooking. As I ate, I kept glancing around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest was still unnervingly quiet. After cleaning up, I decided to call it an early night. I figured a good night's sleep would help shake the strange mood I was in. That night was different. I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the gentle lapping of the lake, but it was there, a soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't constant, just intermittent, like something was stopping and starting as it moved. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? Maybe a raccoon? But the pattern of movement felt deliberate, almost cautious. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. The rustling grew louder, then stopped altogether. I didn't hear anything else for a long time, but I couldn't fall back asleep. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, my ears straining for any sound. Eventually, the first light of dawn filtered through the fabric, and I felt a wave of relief. Whatever had been out there, it seemed to be gone. The next morning, I found tracks around my campsite. They were similar to the ones I'd seen the day before, large and oddly shaped. They circled my tent, coming disturbingly close before leading off into the woods. My stomach sank. Whatever had made those tracks had been right outside while I was inside, lying awake. I decided then and there to cut my trip short. I packed up quickly, my movements hurried and clumsy. The sense of unease had turned into a gnawing anxiety. As I started the hike back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest, once a place of peace, now felt oppressive. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Several times, I thought I heard faint footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. About halfway back to the parking lot, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A tree just off the trail had deep gashes in its bark. They were fresh, the wood underneath pale and raw. The marks were high up, too high for any animal I could think of. I stared at them for a moment, my mind racing. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't close, but it was unmistakable. It sounded like a growl, deep and resonant. I didn't wait to find out what had made the sound. I started walking faster, almost jogging, my eyes scanning the trail ahead and the woods around me. The growl didn't come again, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was drenched in sweat, my legs aching from the hurried pace. My car was the only one there, and I've never been so relieved to see it. As I drove away, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees. But the road behind me was empty, and soon the forest was just a dark blur in the distance. I've thought about that trip a lot since then, replaying every detail in my mind. I don't know what was out there, but I'm certain of one thing. I wasn't alone. Something had been watching me, following me. I've never been back to that lake, and I don't think I ever will. The woods might be beautiful, but they're also vast and wild, and sometimes they remind you that you're not as alone as you think. I've always loved camping. There's something about being surrounded by nothing but trees, mountains, and the sounds of nature that feels grounding, almost like hitting a reset button. I'd planned this particular camping trip for weeks, a solo weekend in the foothills of the Alps. The idea was simple: hike to a remote spot, pitch my tent, and spend 2 nights alone under the stars. No distractions, no people, just me and the wilderness. The first day was perfect. The weather was clear, the trail well marked, and I made good time. My backpack was heavy, but I'd packed everything I needed: food, water, a first aid kit, a lightweight tent, and a reliable sleeping bag. I'd even brought a small book to read by the campfire. By late afternoon, I found a spot that seemed ideal: a clearing near a stream, with a few flat rocks where I could set up my stove. The area was surrounded by tall pines, their tops swaying gently in the wind. It was picturesque, exactly what I'd hoped for. Setting up camp was routine. The tent went up without a hitch, and I collected enough firewood to last the evening. After dinner, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames and listening to the forest. Occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl, but nothing out of the ordinary. The stars were incredible that night, brighter than I'd ever seen. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing from my life for a long time. The first night passed uneventfully, though I woke up a few times. Once, I thought I heard something outside the tent, a faint crunch of leaves, but I chalked it up to an animal and went back to sleep. Morning came quickly, and I felt refreshed and ready to explore the area. I spent the day hiking further up the trail, taking photos, and enjoying the solitude. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I made another fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in for the evening. That's when things started to feel off. It began subtly, a feeling I couldn't quite place. The forest seemed quieter than it had the previous night. The usual background noise of birds and insects was absent, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the weather was changing or the wildlife had moved on. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tightly. I lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside seemed amplified: the creak of a tree, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. I reminded myself that I was in the wilderness. Animals were bound to be nearby. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the light, erratic steps of an animal, but deliberate, measured steps. Someone was walking near my campsite. My heart began to race. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear over the pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. I held my breath, listening. Nothing, just silence again. I told myself it had to be my imagination. Maybe it was a deer, or perhaps the sound of my own heartbeat was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, every nerve in my body on edge. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and immediately noticed something was wrong. The firewood I'd gathered the night before was scattered, as if someone had kicked it around. My food bag, which I'd hung from a tree to keep it away from animals, was on the ground, torn open. Most of the contents were missing. I felt a chill run down my spine. Animals didn't untie knots or deliberately scatter things. Someone had been here. I debated packing up and heading back to the trailhead, but it was a long hike, and I wasn't sure I'd make it before nightfall. Instead, I decided to stay one more night, but I would keep my gear close and sleep with my knife within arm's reach. I spent the day trying to enjoy myself, but the unease lingered. Every sound made me jump, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. As the sun set, I prepared for another uneasy night. I made a small fire but didn't stray far from it. I ate quickly, cleaned up, and secured my food bag more carefully this time. Then I sat by the fire, trying to read my book, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting to the shadows beyond the firelight. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were unmistakable. Someone was walking just beyond the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, my hands trembling. "Who's there?" I wanted to call out, but fear kept me silent. The footsteps stopped again, and I shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam illuminated nothing but trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent, clutching the knife, jumping at every noise. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent, exhausted and jittery. My food bag was untouched this time, but I didn't care. I packed up my gear as quickly as possible, my hands shaking. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the trailhead was grueling. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my heart racing. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk and locked the doors. Only then did I let out a shaky breath. I never found out who or what was out there with me. Maybe it was a prankster, someone trying to scare me. Maybe it was something more sinister. All I know is that the wilderness, once a place of peace and solitude, now feels different. I still go camping, but I'm more cautious. I choose campsites closer to other people, and I always keep a means of self-defense close at hand. That weekend in the Alps taught me a hard lesson. The wild isn't always as empty as it seems. Camping has always been my escape. It's a way for me to disconnect from the hum of everyday life and get lost in the simplicity of nature. I've always believed that the wilderness has its own way of grounding you, stripping away the noise and leaving you with just the basics: shelter, fire, and a sense of your place in the world. This story begins like many others in my life, with me packing up my gear, ready to spend a long weekend in solitude. I had chosen a spot deep in the Adirondacks, a place I'd read about but never visited. It was remote, off the beaten path, and required a few hours of hiking to reach. Exactly what I was looking for. The trail was unmarked, and the only guidance I had was a topo map and a compass. There was no cell service out there, which was part of the appeal. I drove up on a Friday morning, my car loaded with everything I'd need: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, enough food for 3 days, a reliable knife, and a small first aid kit. I double-checked my pack before heading out, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything crucial. Once I was satisfied, I locked up the car, shouldered my pack, and started down the trail. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, the kind where the trees are so thick it's almost dark even in the middle of the day. The air was cool and carried the faint smell of pine and damp earth. I'd forgotten how quiet it could be out here. No cars, no chatter, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional call of a bird. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself in a rhythm. Walk, check the map, adjust my bearings, repeat. I passed a small stream around midday and stopped to refill my water bottle. I had a filter with me, so I wasn't worried about drinking straight from the source. The water was icy cold and refreshing, a reminder of just how untouched this place was. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I'd marked on my map as a good place to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a larger stream, with just enough flat ground for my tent. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was soothing, and I figured it would help me sleep. I set up my tent quickly, making sure it was secure. Then I gathered some wood for a fire, careful not to take anything that was too wet or too large to burn efficiently. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature began to drop. I got a fire going and cooked a simple meal over it. Sitting there, watching the flames dance, I felt a sense of calm that I rarely experienced anywhere else. The stars started to come out, and the night sky was clearer than I'd seen in years. It was perfect, but as the hours passed, that calm started to fade. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a creeping sense of unease. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, being alone in the woods can play tricks on your mind. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig seems louder, more significant. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. Still, I found myself scanning the tree line more often than I should have. My fire cast long, flickering shadows, and the dark spaces between the trees seemed to swallow the light. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. I didn't see anything, though, and after a while, I forced myself to crawl into my tent. I zipped it up tight, laid out my sleeping bag, and settled in for the night. The sound of the stream was still comforting, and I focused on it, hoping it would drown out my thoughts. Sleep came in fits and starts. I'd drift off, only to wake up again a short while later, heart pounding for no apparent reason. At one point, I thought I heard something moving outside the tent, but when I held my breath and listened, there was nothing but the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Morning came slowly. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside, everything looked normal. The clearing was just as I'd left it, and there were no signs of anything unusual. I told myself I'd just let my nerves get the better of me. It happens sometimes, especially when you're alone in a place like this. The second day was uneventful for the most part. I spent the morning exploring the area, sticking close enough to camp that I wouldn't get lost. I found a few interesting spots: a fallen tree that had been hollowed out by years of decay, a cluster of mushrooms growing in a vivid patch of green moss, and a small, hidden pool fed by the stream. It was peaceful, and by midday, I'd mostly forgotten about the unease I'd felt the night before. But as the sun started to set, that feeling crept back in. It was subtle at first, just a vague sense that something wasn't quite right. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on gathering more firewood and preparing another simple meal. The fire helped a little, its warmth and light pushing back against the encroaching darkness. That night was worse than the first. I'd barely fallen asleep when I heard it. A distinct, deliberate sound. It wasn't the random noise of animals moving through the underbrush or the wind rustling the trees. It was footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was close, too close. My tent suddenly felt paper thin, offering no real protection from whatever was out there. I grabbed the knife from my pack and held it tightly, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then slowly they moved away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every sound made me jump, and I kept the knife in my hand, just in case. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. I stepped out of the tent and looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no disturbed underbrush, nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it had been an animal, something larger than I'd expected, but harmless. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I decided to cut my trip short. There was no shame in it, I told myself. Better to head back early than spend another sleepless night. Packing up didn't take long. I made sure to leave the site as I'd found it, not wanting to leave any trace behind. The hike back to the car was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was never anyone there. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I tossed my pack into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. As I started the engine and pulled away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time. The trailhead was empty, the woods silent and still. It wasn't until I was back on the main road, miles away from the campsite, that I allowed myself to relax. Whatever had been out there, it was behind me now, but the experience left a mark. I haven't been able to go camping alone since. The wilderness still calls to me, but now I'm careful to answer with company. Looking back, I still don't know what I heard that night. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe it was another person. Either way, it taught me a valuable lesson. Nature is beautiful, but it's not always as empty as it seems. I always loved camping. It's one of those things that made me feel alive, out in the open, with nothing but the stars above and the ground beneath. I'd spent years camping across the country, from Vermont to the Rockies. So, when I decided to spend a weekend in the Adirondacks, I didn't think much of it. It was supposed to be another quiet trip. Just me, my tent, and the woods. I drove up early on a Friday morning, my car loaded with gear. The campsite I had picked was pretty remote, far from the popular trails and the noise of other campers. That was how I liked it. I didn't want to hear people talking or kids running around. I wanted the quiet. I wanted the solitude. The road leading to the trailhead was rough, barely more than a dirt track. My car's tires kicked up clouds of dust as I drove, and the trees seemed to close in on me the farther I went. It was late morning when I finally reached the parking area, which was really just a clearing big enough for a few cars. Mine was the only vehicle there. Perfect. I grabbed my pack, double-checked my supplies, and started hiking. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, more of a suggestion than a proper path. I had to duck under low branches and step over roots that jutted out like tripwires. The forest was dense, the kind where sunlight barely filters through the canopy. It smelled like damp earth and pine needles, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. It was exactly what I was looking for. After a couple of hours, I reached a small clearing by a stream. It was a perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was flat, and the water was clear and cold. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, facing the stream. Once everything was set up, I sat down on a rock and ate a quick lunch, staring at the water as it flowed over smooth stones. The rest of the afternoon was uneventful. I spent some time exploring the area, following the stream for a while and noting landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. By the time the sun started to dip below the treetops, I was back at my campsite, gathering wood for a fire. I built a small blaze and cooked a simple meal, feeling the kind of contentment that only comes from being far away from everything. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, and frogs croaked from somewhere near the stream. Occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, probably a raccoon or a deer. I wasn't worried. I'd been in the woods enough to know the kinds of noises they make. I sat by the fire until the stars were out in full, then crawled into my tent. The air was cool, and the sleeping bag felt warm and comforting. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the gentle murmur of the stream and the crackling embers of the fire outside. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the forest was dark except for the faint light of the moon filtering through the trees. I lay still, listening. The usual nighttime sounds were there, but something felt off. It was subtle, but it was enough to make my skin prickle. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. My heart started to pound. I told myself it was probably an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The steps were too deliberate, too human. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps continued, slow and methodical, circling the clearing. They never came closer, but they didn't move away either. Whoever or whatever it was, they were staying just out of sight. I'd never felt so vulnerable. My tent, which had felt so secure just hours ago, now seemed like the thinnest barrier imaginable. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything else, but the forest had gone eerily silent. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the clearing was empty. I spent the morning trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it had just been my imagination, that I'd misheard something. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I decided to stay another night, partly because I didn't want to let fear ruin my trip, and partly because I didn't have much choice. The hike back to the car was long, and I didn't want to risk getting caught out on the trail after dark. The second day was quiet, but the sense of unease lingered. I stayed close to camp, keeping my knife within reach at all times. By evening, I had managed to gather enough wood to keep the fire going all night. I wasn't going to let it die down again. As the sun set, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames and listening for any sound out of the ordinary. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer, circling just beyond the edge of the firelight. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I gripped my knife, my eyes scanning the darkness. The fire cast flickering shadows on the trees, making it impossible to tell what was real and what wasn't. Then I saw it, a figure just for a split second, at the edge of the clearing. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was definitely a person. They were standing perfectly still, watching me. My stomach dropped. I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt, but the figure didn't move. I threw a piece of wood into the darkness, and when I looked back, they were gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire blazing and sat with my back to my tent, my knife in one hand and a heavy branch in the other. Every noise made me jump, and I kept expecting the figure to reappear, but they didn't. When morning finally came, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I didn't bother with breakfast or trying to enjoy the last bit of my trip. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the car felt twice as long as it had on the way in. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me whip around, expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the parking area, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but that relief was short-lived. There, scratched into the dirt next to my car, were the words, "See you soon." I don't know how they found my car, or how they managed to get there before me without me noticing. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I threw my pack into the trunk, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as I could. That was the last time I went camping alone. Even now, years later, I can't stop thinking about that trip. I'll never know who was out there or what they wanted. But one thing is certain, they were watching me, and they wanted me to know it.